I remember the sound more than anything else. It wasn't an animal sound. Not like any I'd heard in the 20 years I'd been working parks. Not the throaty growl of a grizzly defending her cubs, not the bone-chilling scream of a mountain lion in the dark, not even the haunting call of a loon across midnight water. This was something else entirely. It was deep, slow, and it vibrated through the air in a way that made my teeth ache. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through my chest cavity like standing too close to a massive church bell. It made my bones feel hollow, made my vision blur at the edges. The frequency was all wrong for any living thing I knew. I was waist-deep in Whispering Vale Lake, the glacial water cutting into my skin like 1,000 tiny knives, trying not to breathe too loud. The cold was so intense it had moved beyond pain into something worse, a burning numbness that made my legs feel like wooden posts driven into the lakebed. My ranger uniform clung to my body, waterlogged and heavy, dragging me down with each small movement I made. My flashlight beam bobbed across the surface, the LED cutting through the darkness in wild arcs as my hands shook uncontrollably. The light caught glimpses of God, I don't even know what. Ripples that moved against the wind. Shadows that seemed to have depth and weight. And something else, something that made my rational mind shut down like a computer hitting a fatal error. It stood on the far bank of Whispering Vale, half hidden by the ancient pines that ringed the water like mourners at a funeral, just watching me. The trees themselves seemed wrong in its presence, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. The thing, and I use that word because no other fits, was perfectly still. Not the alertness of a wild animal, not the patience of a predator. This was the stillness of something that had all the time in the world. Not moving. Not blinking. At least, I don't think it was blinking. The darkness made it hard to tell if it even had eyes, but I could feel its attention on me like a physical weight. Like standing under a heat lamp, but cold. So terribly cold. I could feel it smiling without ever seeing its face. The certainty of that smile, wide and knowing and hungry, hit me like a physical blow. My stomach dropped, and for a moment I thought I might vomit right there in the water. The thing knew something I didn't. Something about me. Something about what was going to happen next. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, maybe just a bear, maybe just the moon playing tricks through the cloud cover, maybe just the shadows of the pines moving in ways that confused my exhausted mind. Rangers see things after long days. Fatigue does funny things to perception. I'd heard stories from the old-timers about phantom hikers and ghost lights. This had to be something like that. But then it leaned forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a dancer finding their balance. It tilted toward the water with impossible grace, and as it did, I realized just how tall it was. Even bent forward, its head was level with branches that I knew were 15 feet off the ground. And I swear to you, its arms touched the water from 30 feet away. The ripples spread outward from where its fingers, or what I hoped were fingers, disturbed the surface. Perfect concentric circles that caught what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. The physics of it made no sense. The thing was on the far shore of Whispering Vale Lake, easily 30 feet from where I stood, but somehow its reach extended across that impossible distance like the laws of anatomy meant nothing to it. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with anything that belonged in the natural world. That's when I knew I was in trouble deeper than the freezing water that was slowly stealing the feeling from my legs. That's when I knew that whatever was watching me from the shadows had been waiting for me long before I'd ever set foot on the trail to Whispering Vale. It started as a routine solo patrol in Glacier National Park, the kind of assignment that gets handed out on slow summer evenings when the real excitement is limited to tourists feeding chipmunks and lost hikers who thought flip-flops were appropriate mountain footwear. Most people think ranger work is just answering tourist questions and pointing out moose, maybe giving the occasional safety lecture about proper food storage. They see the uniform and think we're glorified camp counselors with badges. They don't see the nights like this, when you're sent to check on a remote area because someone thought they saw a suspicious light. They don't know about the calls that come in at dusk, whispered reports from the few locals brave enough or foolish enough to venture into the deep wilderness. They don't understand that sometimes we get sent out knowing full well we might not come back, and that the radio silence from base isn't always due to equipment failure. The lake in question wasn't on any tourist map, wasn't mentioned in any of the glossy brochures that promised visitors a glimpse of pristine American wilderness. The old-timers at the station called it Whispering Vale Lake, though I'd never seen that name on any official documentation. It was the kind of place that existed in the spaces between mapped territories, tucked away where the government surveys had been sloppy or incomplete. You had to take the Shadowmere Trail, if you could even call it that, 3 miles from the nearest maintained road. The trail was little more than a deer path in most places, marked only by occasional cairns that looked like they'd been built by someone with shaking hands. Rangers had been using it for decades to access the backcountry, but it wasn't the kind of route you'd recommend to civilians. Too easy to get lost. Too easy to take a wrong turn and find yourself in country that wasn't on any map at all. No cell service out there, of course. The mountains played hell with signals, and the thick canopy of old-growth forest didn't help matters. No backup closer than 45 minutes, assuming they could find you at all in terrain that seemed to shift and change when you weren't looking directly at it. It was the kind of assignment that separated the experienced rangers from the greenhorns who still believed that civilization was just a radio call away. Whispering Vale itself was a glassy, blue-green body of water tucked under a wall of granite cliffs that rose like the sides of a cathedral. The stone was dark with age and moisture, streaked with veins of some mineral that caught light in unsettling ways. During certain times of day, when the sun hit those streaks just right, the cliff face looked like it was bleeding. The water was so clear you could see straight to the bottom in most places, could make out individual rocks and the bleached bones of trees that had fallen in decades ago. It was the kind of place that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The kind of place where sound carried strangely, where your own footsteps seemed to echo back from impossible directions. Local wildlife avoided it, for reasons that the Park Service had never been able to explain. No fish in the water, despite its being connected to streams that teemed with trout. No deer tracks along the shore, even though the grass grew thick and green right up to the waterline. Even the insects seemed reluctant to venture too close. I signed out at base around 4:30, told dispatch I'd check in every hour on the dot, and started up the Shadowmere Trail around 5 p.m. The report had come in from a backpacker who'd been camping illegally in the area, something about lights moving under the water, sounds that didn't belong. The guy had hiked out in the middle of the night, left his gear behind, and driven straight to the station to file a report. He'd been shaking when he told his story, kept looking over his shoulder like he expected something to follow him right into the building. The evening was still and clear when I set out, the kind of perfect Montana summer weather that draws tourists from all over the world. But as I climbed higher into the mountains, following the winding path through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, the air grew cooler and heavier. The usual evening sounds of the forest, birds settling in for the night, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, gradually faded until I was walking in an unnatural quiet. By the time I reached Whispering Vale, the sun was low enough that the peaks were throwing long shadows over the water, turning the surface into a dark mirror that reflected the sky in ways that hurt to look at directly. The silence was complete now, so total that I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the whisper of my breath in my lungs. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. And that's when I saw the first ripple. It started near the center of the lake and spread outward, slow and steady, like something big had just surfaced from the depths. But the water stayed perfectly clear, and when I aimed my flashlight at the spot where the disturbance had originated, there was nothing there. Just that dark, still water, reflecting my light back at me like a mirror made of black glass. Except the water stayed perfectly clear, and I could see all the way to the bottom. Whatever had made that ripple, it wasn't there anymore. Or maybe it had never been there at all. At first, I thought it was a beaver or maybe an otter. We get both out here, and they'll sometimes cut across the lake in late evening when they think they're safe from predators. The wilderness around Whispering Vale was full of streams and ponds that attracted all kinds of aquatic wildlife, and it wouldn't have been unusual to spot something taking a shortcut through the deeper water. But the ripple was too wide, too deliberate. Whatever made it had to be big, way bigger than anything that should have been living in that water. The disturbance spread outward in perfect concentric circles, each ring catching what little light remained in the sky. I'd seen enough wildlife in my 20 years of ranger work to know the difference between a small animal and something substantial moving through water. I swept my flashlight over the surface, but the sun hadn't fully set yet, so the LED beam just got swallowed by the glare reflecting off the water. The light seemed weaker out here somehow, as if the very air was absorbing its strength. Still, I caught movement, just the faintest disturbance beneath the surface, like something was gliding slow and deliberate toward shore. The shadow was massive, easily the size of a canoe, moving with a fluid grace that made my skin crawl. Now, here's the thing about glacial lakes like Whispering Vale. The water is cold, bone-achingly, hypothermia-inducingly cold, even in the middle of summer when the air temperature hits 80 degrees. Most of these lakes never warm above 50 degrees, even in the shallows. You'd last maybe 10 minutes in water like that before your muscles started to seize up, maybe 20 if you were lucky and in excellent shape. Not a place you'd ever swim by choice, especially not this far out in the wilderness where help was hours away. So the idea that it was a person? Not likely. Not unless they had a death wish or equipment I couldn't see. And the movement pattern was all wrong for a human anyway. Too smooth, too purposeful. Humans splash and struggle in cold water. Whatever was down there moved like it belonged. I tried my radio, turning the volume up and switching to the emergency channel. Static filled the air, not the broken kind where you can tell someone's talking and the signal's bad, not the crackling interference you get from atmospheric conditions. This was pure, empty static, like the radio was picking up signals from the void between stars. I switched channels, tried again, even attempted to raise the weather service. Nothing but that same hollow emptiness. The silence after I turned off the radio was worse than the static had been. It pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight, made me aware of every small sound my body made. The rustle of my uniform, the whisper of air through my nostrils, the quiet gurgle of my stomach processing the trail mix I'd eaten on the hike up. In that absolute stillness, I felt like the loudest thing for miles. I figured maybe the light someone had reported was just reflection off the water, the sunset hitting the surface at just the right angle to create an optical illusion. It happened sometimes in country like this, where the terrain played tricks on perception and shadows moved in ways that didn't quite make sense. I decided to do a quick perimeter walk, check for any obvious signs of human activity, and then head back to base to file a routine report. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were pressed into the muddy shore about 20 feet from where I stood, clear enough in the soft earth that I could make out individual details. But the details were all wrong. They weren't bear tracks, too narrow, too elongated, and missing the distinctive claw marks that grizzlies and black bears leave behind. They weren't moose either, which would have shown the characteristic split-hoof impression. These weren't even close to any animal tracks I'd ever seen in my 2 decades of wilderness work. These were long, almost finger-like impressions in the mud, each one about 8 inches in length and surprisingly deep. The spacing was irregular, as if whatever had made them wasn't following the normal gait pattern of any land animal. But the most disturbing detail was how they seemed to have been made, as if something with hands had crawled out of the water on its fingertips, then somehow stood upright. The stride pattern was completely wrong for anything I could identify. Whatever it wasn't walking like a man or an animal. The impressions showed signs of dragging between the individual prints, as if the creature was pulling something heavy behind it, either a damaged foot, a tail, or something else entirely. The drag marks were smooth and continuous, carved into the mud with consistent pressure that suggested incredible strength. I'll admit, I should have turned back right then. Every instinct developed over 20 years of ranger work was telling me to retreat, to get back on the radio and call for backup, to treat this as a potential hazard and follow proper protocol. But if you've ever been a ranger, you know how the job gets into your bones, becomes part of who you are at a fundamental level. We're trained to investigate, to make sure hikers are safe, to be the eyes and ears of the wilderness for people who can't protect themselves. The badge isn't just decoration, it's a responsibility that weighs on you every time you put on the uniform. Someone had reported unusual activity out here, and it was my job to determine whether that activity posed a threat to public safety. So I followed the tracks, my flashlight beam dancing across the impressions as they led away from the water's edge. The trail was easy enough to follow at first, the soft ground near the lake holding the impressions clearly. But as the creature's path moved into the tree line, the tracks became fainter, harder to distinguish from the natural irregularities of the forest floor. The trees seemed different here, older and more gnarled than the pines I'd passed on my way to the lake. Their bark was darker, almost black in places, and covered with a kind of moss I'd never seen before. The stuff grew in patterns that looked almost deliberate, like someone had been cultivating it for decades. The very air felt heavier under the canopy, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. They led into the tree line on the far side of Whispering Vale Lake, following what might have once been a game trail but was now little more than a gap between the massive trunks. My boots crunched on fallen needles and small branches, each sound seeming unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. The beam of my flashlight seemed weaker here, as if the trees themselves were absorbing the light. And that's where I found the first sign that this wasn't just some animal encounter. The first sign that whatever had made those tracks was intelligent, purposeful, and possibly very dangerous. It was a tent, or what was left of one. The remains were scattered across a small clearing about 50 yards from the lake shore, in what had clearly been intended as a campsite. Someone had chosen the spot carefully, picking level ground with good drainage and natural windbreaks. But now the scene looked like a bomb had gone off. The tent itself was completely shredded, the nylon fabric hanging in ribbons from poles that had been bent in half with tremendous force. The aluminum supports, designed to withstand high winds and heavy snow, were twisted into shapes that defied explanation. Whatever had destroyed this campsite possessed strength far beyond what any normal predator could bring to bear. The sleeping bag was torn open like someone had taken a knife to it, the down insulation scattered across the clearing like snow. Personal effects were strewn everywhere, clothes, camping gear, food containers that had been crushed flat. But there was something strange about the destruction pattern. It wasn't random, wasn't the chaotic damage you'd expect from a bear or other large predator tearing through a campsite looking for food. This was deliberate. Methodical. Like something had been searching for something specific. And no blood. Despite the violence of the destruction, despite the clear signs of struggle, there wasn't a single drop of blood anywhere in the clearing. Not on the shredded fabric, not on the bent tent poles, not on the ground where someone had clearly been sleeping when the attack occurred. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't involved the kind of mauling you'd expect from a wild animal encounter. Even stranger, there were no footprints leaving the camp either, just those same dragging impressions heading back toward the water, as if whatever had destroyed the campsite had returned to the depths of Whispering Vale Lake when its work was finished. I crouched down to get a closer look at the destroyed gear, trying to piece together what might have happened. The fabric of the tent showed clean tears in some places, ragged rips in others. Some of the damage looked like it had been made by claws or teeth, but other sections appeared to have been cut with surgical precision. The sleeping bag had been opened along its seams, as if something had carefully undone the stitching rather than simply tearing it apart. My flashlight beam caught something glinting in the pile of debris, a driver's license, partially buried under a destroyed camp chair. I brushed away the dirt and pine needles to read the name, Marcus Webb, address in Billings. The photo showed a young man with short brown hair and a confident smile. Probably a college student, maybe someone taking advantage of summer break to explore the wilderness. But where was Marcus now? That's when I heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand on end, that sent ice-cold adrenaline flooding through my veins. A breath. Slow. Deep. Deliberate. Just a few feet behind me. The exhale was long and controlled, the kind of breathing you might hear from someone trying to stay calm, trying not to make noise. But there was something wrong with the sound, something that my brain couldn't quite process. The breath was too big, too deep, as if it was coming from lungs designed for a much larger creature than anything that should have been standing behind me in those woods. I crouched there frozen, not daring to move, not daring to turn around, feeling that presence behind me like a weight pressing against my back. Whatever was breathing back there was close enough that I could feel the air displacement from its exhalations, could sense the heat, or was it cold, radiating from its body? In that moment, surrounded by the remains of Marcus Webb's destroyed campsite, I finally understood that I was no longer the predator in this situation. I was the prey. I spun so fast my boots nearly slipped on the carpet of wet pine needles that covered the forest floor. My hand went instinctively to my service weapon, fingers fumbling with the safety strap as I swept my flashlight in a wide arc behind me. Nothing there. Just the dark spaces between the ancient pines, their trunks rising like pillars in a cathedral built for something other than human worship. But the trees were too quiet. Not just the normal quiet of evening woods, but something deeper, more fundamental. It was as if every living thing in a quarter-mile radius had suddenly stopped breathing at the same moment. No wind stirring the branches overhead. No crickets beginning their evening chorus. No birds settling in for the night with rustling feathers and soft calls. The absence of sound was so complete it felt like being inside a vacuum chamber, like the forest itself had been drained of life. You ever been in a place so silent that you start to hear your own heartbeat in your ears? That's how it was. The blood rushing through my carotid arteries sounded like distant thunder, and I could hear the whistle of air through my nostrils with each nervous breath. My own body seemed impossibly loud in that dead quiet, like I was broadcasting my location to everything within miles. And then, another ripple on Whispering Vale Lake. This time I saw it happen. Something beneath the surface moved, something large enough to displace significant volume of water. The ripples spread outward in those same perfect concentric circles, but now I could see the dark shadow that caused them, a shape gliding just below the surface with fluid, purposeful movement. I started backing toward the Shadowmere Trail, my hand finally managing to release the safety strap on my sidearm. The weight of the weapon was reassuring, familiar, a connection to my training and 20 years of experience in situations that required calm thinking and decisive action. I'm not the type to pull a gun at every rustle in the brush. That's how innocent hikers get shot by jumpy rangers who've watched too many horror movies. But this didn't feel like a curious bear investigating an unusual scent. This didn't feel like a mountain lion sizing up potential prey, or even a pack of wolves testing the boundaries of human territory. This felt like something that knew exactly what I was, where I was, and what I was capable of. Something that was making calculated decisions about how to handle my presence. This felt like something that knew I was alone, miles from backup, with no way to call for help. Something that understood the tactical situation better than I did. And then I saw it. Far across Whispering Vale Lake, just where the last light was bleeding out of the sky behind the granite peaks, something broke the surface. It rose from the water with the slow deliberation of a submarine surfacing, shedding sheets of lake water that caught the dying light like liquid silver. Tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, and impossibly thin, like wet rope pulled taut between 2 points. Its silhouette was wrong in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it directly. The proportions were human enough to be recognizable but alien enough to trigger every evolutionary alarm system built into my nervous system over millions of years. Its head was the worst part. Long and narrow, like a horse's skull that had been stretched in a vise, but with no eyes that I could see. At least, no eyes in the places where eyes should have been. The skull seemed to be covered in something that gleamed wetly in the dim light, skin, perhaps, or something that had once been skin but had been underwater too long. And those arms. Jesus Christ, those arms. I thought they were just long at first, disproportionately lengthy like you might see on someone with Marfan syndrome. But then one reached out across the 30 feet of dark water that separated us, and I realized that long wasn't adequate to describe what I was seeing. The joint, shoulder, elbow, or something else entirely, bent in ways that violated everything I understood about anatomy. The arm telescoped outward like the segments of a fishing rod extending, each section sliding smoothly into position with mechanical precision. Bone and sinew and something else, something that gleamed like polished metal in the darkness. It touched the water on my side of the shore with fingers that were too long, too thin, each one tipped with what looked like polished bone. The hand, if you could call it that, was easily twice the size of my own, with joints in places where human hands don't have joints. When it pressed against the muddy bank, I could hear the soft squelch of earth being displaced by something far heavier than it appeared. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked up as my brain tried to process what I was seeing, tried to fit this impossible thing into some category that made rational sense. It wasn't possible. The creature was across the lake. I could see its body still standing in the shallows on the far shore, but its arm had somehow extended across 30 feet of open water to brush the mud right next to my boot. The physics of it were impossible. The biology of it was nightmare. And yet I could feel the vibration through the ground as those bone-white fingers pressed into the earth, could smell something like ozone and decay wafting up from where it touched. I did what any rational person wouldn't do in that situation. I stepped back. My survival instincts were screaming at me to run, to put distance between myself and this thing that shouldn't exist, but my body was moving in slow motion, like I was underwater myself. The hand followed my movement. As I backed away, those fingers tracked my position with predatory precision, pressing new impressions into the soft earth exactly where my boots had been standing moments before. It was testing my reaction, learning how I moved, cataloging my behavioral patterns like a scientist studying a lab rat. Then, just as the last bit of sun slipped away behind the mountain peaks and true darkness settled over Whispering Vale Lake, it yanked back into the water like it had never been there. The arm retracted with the same mechanical precision it had extended, joint folding into joint until the entire appendage disappeared beneath the surface without so much as a ripple to mark its passage. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. I stood there in the darkness, flashlight beam trembling in my shaking hands, trying to convince myself that I'd hallucinated the entire encounter. Altitude sickness, maybe. Dehydration. Some kind of stress-induced psychotic break brought on by too many years of dealing with the isolation and responsibility that comes with wilderness work. But the impressions in the mud were still there, still fresh, still impossibly deep for something that shouldn't have been able to reach across 30 feet of water. The evidence of what I'd seen was right there in the soft earth, clear as day in the beam of my flashlight. At this point, I was breathing hard, my chest rising and falling like I'd just finished a sprint up a mountain slope. I swept my light across the tree-line and the water, trying to catch any sign of movement, any hint of where the thing had gone or what it planned to do next. The darkness seemed deeper now, more complete, as if the creature's presence had somehow absorbed light from the surrounding area. My training told me to assess the situation calmly, to gather information and make rational decisions based on available evidence. But every instinct developed over 40 years of life was screaming at me to get the hell away from Whispering Vale Lake as fast as my legs could carry me. And that's when my radio crackled to life. Not with a voice, not with the familiar sound of dispatch trying to raise me for my hourly check-in, not with the chatter of other rangers coordinating their evening activities. The sound that came through the speaker was something else entirely, something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was breathing. Low and wet, like someone with damaged lungs trying to draw air through fluid. The exhalation was long and ragged, followed by an inhalation that seemed to go on forever. And underneath it, almost too faint to hear, was something that might have been voices, multiple voices, all whispering at once in languages I didn't recognize. Then came a single word, spoken so softly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Found. The word hung in the air like smoke, seeming to echo from multiple directions at once. It wasn't transmitted through the radio speaker, it was coming from everywhere, from the trees, from the water, from the very air around me. The sound wrapped around me like a physical presence, and I could feel it settling into my bones with a cold weight that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I bolted for the Shadowmere Trail. I didn't care what protocol said, didn't care about proper procedure or chain of command or filing complete reports. Whatever was in Whispering Vale Lake, whatever had destroyed Marcus Webb's campsite, whatever had just spoken to me through a radio that should have been receiving nothing but static, I wanted as much distance between me and it as possible. But as I stumbled through the darkness, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each step, I began to realize that the trail wasn't quite how I remembered it. The pines felt closer together, their branches reaching across the path in ways that forced me to duck and weave. The familiar landmarks I'd noted on my way in, a lightning-split Douglas fir, a boulder shaped like a crouching bear, were nowhere to be found. And the air smelled wrong. Sweet, almost sickly so, like rotting fruit left too long in the sun. The scent grew stronger as I moved deeper into the forest, until it was thick enough to taste on the back of my tongue. It reminded me of something, some half-remembered experience that my mind was working hard to forget. That's when I saw the light ahead. A small, dim glow bobbing between the trees, like a lantern being carried by someone walking slowly through the forest. Relief hit me so hard my knees almost buckled under the weight of it. Another ranger, maybe, or a search and rescue team that had been dispatched when I'd missed my check-in. Maybe a lost hiker with enough sense to carry proper lighting. I thought, maybe another ranger. Maybe a lost hiker who'd gotten turned around in the dark and was looking for the trail back to civilization. Maybe someone who could help me make sense of what I'd just experienced, could provide a rational explanation that would let me file this whole thing under equipment malfunction and stress-induced hallucination. I ran toward it, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches with desperate urgency. Thorns tore at my uniform and face, but I didn't care. The light meant safety, meant sanity, meant I wasn't alone in this nightmare wilderness with something that shouldn't exist. It took me 5 full minutes of running through increasingly thick forest to realize that I was back at Whispering Vale Lake. The same dark water, the same granite cliffs, the same oppressive silence that felt like being wrapped in a burial shroud. Somehow, despite running in what I was certain was a straight line away from the lake, I'd ended up right back where I'd started. The physics of it were impossible, but then, so was everything else that had happened in the last hour. The glow on the far bank bobbed gently, like it was being carried by someone walking along the shore. But now that I was closer, I could see that the light wasn't coming from any kind of lantern or flashlight I recognized. It pulsed with a rhythm that was almost organic, brightening and dimming like a massive firefly. And the color was wrong, not the warm yellow of an incandescent bulb or the harsh white of an LED, but something greener, colder, like the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures. The glow on the far bank of Whispering Vale Lake bobbed gently, hypnotically, like it was being carried by someone walking with measured, deliberate steps. From this distance, it looked almost normal, just another lost hiker with a flashlight, trying to find their way back to the main trail system. But the longer I stared at it, the more wrong details emerged from the darkness. The light pulsed with an organic rhythm, brightening and fading like a giant heartbeat made visible. And the color was completely wrong, not the reliable yellow glow of a traditional flashlight or the harsh white beam of a modern LED. This was something greener, colder, like the bioluminescence I'd seen in nature documentaries about creatures that lived in ocean trenches where sunlight never reached. Relief flooded through me anyway, so intense it made my vision blur at the edges. After what I'd experienced, any sign of human presence felt like salvation. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted across the water, my voice echoing off the granite cliffs that surrounded the lake. "Hey! Ranger Service! You okay over there?" The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, bouncing back and forth between the stone walls until they became unintelligible. But my call had an immediate effect on the light. It stopped moving, freezing in place like whoever was carrying it had suddenly become aware of my presence. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. The light remained stationary, pulsing with that same organic rhythm, while I strained my eyes trying to make out the shape of whoever was holding it. The silence was absolute, so complete that I could hear my own pulse hammering against my eardrums. Then the light blinked out, vanishing so suddenly it left purple afterimages dancing across my retinas. That unnatural silence came back, the deep, suffocating kind where the world feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. My chest went cold with a fear that was beyond rational thought, beyond anything my training had prepared me to handle. Every cell in my body was screaming warnings that my conscious mind was still struggling to accept. I swept my flashlight across the far bank, the LED beam cutting through the darkness with desperate urgency. The shoreline looked empty, just the same ancient pines I'd seen before, their branches hanging motionless in the still air. No sign of whoever had been carrying that strange light, no indication that anyone had ever been there at all. But the ripples were back. This time I could see them clearly, spreading outward from multiple points on the surface of Whispering Vale Lake. Whatever was causing them was moving fast now, no longer content to glide slowly through the depths. The disturbances were heading directly toward my position, converging like the wake patterns of several boats racing toward shore. My fight-or-flight response switched hard to flight. Every rational thought vanished, replaced by pure animal panic that bypassed my conscious mind entirely. I spun and bolted for the Shadowmere Trail again, my boots hammering against the forest floor with a rhythm that sounded like gunshots in the oppressive quiet. Branches whipped against my shoulders and face as I ran, leaving stinging welts that I didn't feel until much later. My flashlight beam bounced wildly with each step, creating a strobing effect that made the trees around me seem to flicker in and out of existence like images from an old film reel. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something, every gap between trunks seemed like a potential ambush point. I was halfway up the incline when that sickly sweet smell hit me again, stronger now, so concentrated it made my eyes water and my throat close up. It was the smell of decay, of things that had been dead and underwater for far too long, mixed with something else that my brain refused to identify. The stench was so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue, coating my mouth with a flavor like copper pennies and rotting flowers. It was heavy in the back of my throat now, clinging to my sinuses and making each breath a struggle against nausea. The odor seemed to have weight, pressing down on me like a physical presence that grew stronger with each step I took up the trail. And with it came something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Footsteps. Not the heavy crash of a bear moving through underbrush, not the careful, measured pace of an experienced hiker navigating rough terrain in the dark. These were different, wet and slapping, like something barefoot was running behind me across ground that should have been dry pine needles and rocky soil. The sound was wrong in ways that my mind struggled to process. Each footfall seemed to last too long, as if whatever was making them had too much surface area in contact with the ground. And there was a liquid quality to each step, a squelching noise that suggested the creature was leaving puddles of something behind with every stride. I didn't turn around. Every survival instinct screaming in my head was unified on that point. Whatever was behind me, looking at it would be a mistake I wouldn't survive. My peripheral vision caught glimpses of movement, dark shapes flitting between the trees just outside the range of my flashlight beam, but I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead and focused on putting one boot in front of the other. I couldn't turn around because every fiber of my being was certain that if I saw what was chasing me, I wouldn't keep running. I'd freeze up completely, or worse, I'd do something that would get me killed. My lizard brain, the part of my nervous system that had kept my ancestors alive through millions of years of being hunted by things with more teeth and claws than they had, was in complete control now. The footsteps got closer, matching my pace exactly but gaining ground with each stride. Whatever was behind me was faster than I was, more comfortable moving through this terrain in absolute darkness. I could hear its breathing now, ragged and wet, like air being forced through damaged tissue. Each exhalation was accompanied by a sound like water dripping, as if the thing was shedding moisture with every breath. Then the footsteps stopped. The sudden absence of sound was somehow worse than the pursuit had been. I risked a glance over my shoulder, just a quick look to confirm that I'd imagined the whole thing, that my stressed mind had conjured phantom pursuers from the natural sounds of a forest at night. Nothing. Just the trail vanishing into darkness behind me, empty of everything except my own footprints in the soft earth. The trees stood motionless, their branches casting twisted shadows in my flashlight beam, but there was no sign of whatever had been following me up the slope. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that I'd outrun it, whatever it was. That I'd reached some kind of territorial boundary that the creature wouldn't cross, or that my panic had given me enough speed to break away from something that preferred to hunt slower, more methodical prey. And then, a pale, skeletal thing shot out from between two massive pines beside the trail and clamped around my right wrist with strength that felt like being caught in a mechanical vice. The contact was so sudden, so completely unexpected, that I didn't even have time to cry out before it had me. The skin, if it was skin, was slick and cold, like it had just been pulled from a bucket of ice water. But underneath that initial chill was something worse, a texture that felt wrong against human touch, like wet leather stretched over joints that bent in impossible directions. The grip was impossibly strong, strong enough that I could feel my bones grinding against each other under the pressure. My flashlight clattered to the ground, spinning the beam wildly across the forest floor until it came to rest pointing back down the trail toward Whispering Vale Lake. In that strobing, chaotic light, I caught glimpses of what had grabbed me, fragments of an image that my mind kept trying to reject. The arm kept extending out of the darkness between the trees, joint after joint unfolding like sections of a telescope. Each segment was pale as bone in the darkness, covered with that same wet, leather-like skin that gleamed in my flashlight beam. But the joints, God, the joints were all wrong, bending in directions that violated every principle of anatomy I understood. It was like watching a mechanical device disguised as something organic, as if someone had built a grasping appendage out of materials that had once been alive but had been repurposed for something that had never been natural. The arms seemed to stretch forever, being fed from somewhere deeper in the forest where my light couldn't reach. I shouted, not words, just a raw sound of terror and rage and desperate defiance. My free hand went to my service weapon, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had failed. The familiar weight of the pistol was reassuring, a connection to my training and 20 years of experience dealing with dangerous situations. But as I brought the gun up, my flashlight beam swung across something that made my finger freeze on the trigger. I wish I could say it was a face. At least a face would have been something I could understand, something that fit into categories my brain was equipped to handle. Human faces, animal faces, even the twisted features of something diseased or deformed, all of these would have been preferable to what I actually saw. It was just teeth. A vertical slit in the darkness between the pines, lined with jagged, two human teeth, opening and closing like a gill breathing water instead of air. The teeth were perfect, white and straight like someone who'd never missed a dental appointment, but there were too many of them, arranged in rows that extended far back into what should have been a throat. The opening pulsed rhythmically, each contraction revealing more teeth deeper inside, layer after layer of enamel that caught my light and threw it back in sharp, blinding reflections. It was breathing through its mouth, if you could call that arrangement of bone and flesh a mouth, drawing air in through that vertical slit with wet, sucking sounds. There was intelligence behind those teeth, a calculating awareness that studied me with the same clinical interest a scientist might show toward a particularly interesting specimen. It knew exactly what it was doing, knew exactly how much pressure to apply to keep me immobilized without crushing my bones to powder. I drew my sidearm with my left hand and fired, the muzzle flash lighting up the forest like a camera strobe. The shot was deafening in the stillness, echoing off the granite cliffs and rolling through the valleys like thunder. The bullet struck something solid, I heard the impact, felt the recoil through my arm, but the result wasn't what I'd expected. The thing's grip spasmed once, twice, fingers contracting with enough force to make me gasp in pain. But instead of releasing me, instead of retreating or showing any sign of injury, it simply paused. Like it was considering this new development, analyzing the threat level I represented and adjusting its tactics accordingly. Then it let go and slid back into the trees like a tape measure retracting, joint folding into joint with mechanical precision until the entire appendage had vanished into the darkness. The movement was so smooth, so controlled, that it seemed almost casual, like it was bored with me, like I'd failed some kind of test and was no longer worthy of its attention. I snatched my flashlight and ran without looking back. The Shadowmere trail seemed to go on forever, stretching through forest that grew more alien with each step. I should have hit the service road within 15 minutes of hard running, should have seen the familiar landmarks that marked the transition from wilderness back to the maintained areas where civilization still held some influence. But every bend just led to another stretch of trees, another section of trail that looked identical to what I'd just passed. The pines grew closer together here, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so thick that even my flashlight seemed weak and ineffective. The very air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl and my hair stand on end. The smell was getting worse, that sickly sweet stench of decay and something else, something that reminded me of hospitals and morgues and places where death was processed with clinical efficiency. It was so thick now that I had to breathe through my mouth, but that just made it worse because I could taste it on my tongue, coating the inside of my mouth with a flavor that made me want to vomit. And then I heard them. Voices, soft and muffled, dozens of them all talking at once in languages I didn't recognize. The words were too low to make out clearly, but there was something familiar about the rhythm, the cadence of conversation. It sounded almost like a crowd of people having quiet discussions, the kind of background murmur you might hear at a wake or funeral reception. But the voices were coming from below. I stopped running and looked down at the ground under my boots. In the beam of my flashlight, the earth looked normal enough, the familiar carpet of pine needles and small branches that covered most forest floors in this part of Montana. But something was wrong with the way it felt underfoot, wrong with the way it responded to pressure. The ground was soft, softer than forest floor had any right to be. It felt more like walking on thick moss or spongy peat, material that gave way under my weight and seemed to have depth that extended far below the surface layer of decomposing organic matter. As I stood there listening to those whispered conversations, the earth beneath me began to shift. It started as a barely perceptible tremor, like the vibration you might feel standing near a busy highway. But the movement grew stronger, more pronounced, until I could see the pine needles dancing on the surface like popcorn in a pan. The voices grew louder too, more urgent, as if whatever was speaking below had become aware of my presence. I tried to step backward, to get away from whatever was happening under my feet, but it was too late. The ground tilted suddenly, canting at an angle that sent me sliding toward what I now realized wasn't solid earth at all. The surface gave way completely, collapsing inward like a sinkhole opening up, and for one terrifying moment I was falling through space with nothing but darkness below me. But instead of hitting hard ground or rock, I landed in something that felt like thick mud or standing water. I leapt back just in time, scrambling up the slope on hands and knees as the hole widened behind me. In the brief second before the ground stabilized again, my flashlight beam penetrated the opening and showed me what lay beneath the false forest floor. Water. Dark, still water that reflected my light like black glass. And reaching up through that water toward the surface were dozens of pale arms, all moving with the same fluid grace I'd seen at the lake. The limbs emerged from depths I couldn't measure, stretching upward with fingers outstretched like plants reaching for sunlight. But these weren't the appendages of something trying to escape. They were positioning themselves, arranging their reach to cover maximum area, preparing for something to fall into their grasp. The voices I'd been hearing weren't coming from below the ground, they were coming from below the water, muffled conversations between things that had been waiting patiently for someone like me to stumble into their carefully prepared trap. I ran without looking back, my boots finding purchase on solid ground that felt reassuringly normal after that glimpse into whatever lay beneath the surface of this nightmare forest. My lungs burned with each breath of that putrid air, and my legs felt like rubber from adrenaline and exhaustion, but I didn't stop moving. At some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when, the voices stopped. The sickly sweet smell began to thin, gradually replaced by the clean scent of pine and mountain air that I'd grown to love over 2 decades of wilderness work. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me since I'd first seen those ripples on Whispering Vale Lake began to lift. The forest opened up gradually, the trees spacing themselves at normal intervals, their branches no longer forming that claustrophobic canopy overhead. Familiar landmarks began to appear in my flashlight beam, the lightning-split Douglas fir, the boulder shaped like a crouching bear, the small stream that crossed the trail about a quarter-mile from the parking area. My truck was there when I finally stumbled out of the tree lean, sitting in the small gravel turnout exactly where I'd left it hours earlier. The sight of that familiar government vehicle, with its official Park Service markings and radio antenna, was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It represented safety, civilization, a return to a world where the laws of physics still applied and nightmare creatures didn't exist. I didn't stop moving until I was inside the cab, engine roaring to life, headlights cutting through the darkness like twin swords. The familiar sounds of the diesel engine and the feel of the steering wheel under my hands helped ground me in reality, reminded me that there was still a world beyond the horrors I'd witnessed at Whispering Vale Lake. As I pulled onto the service road, gravel crunching under my tires, I allowed myself one glance in the rearview mirror. Just to confirm that I'd really escaped, that I was actually heading back toward the safety of the ranger station and my fellow human beings. Something was standing in the middle of the road behind me. Tall and impossibly thin, its silhouette unmistakable even in the red glow of my taillights. Those arms that had seemed so impossibly long at the lake were now clearly visible, hanging down until the fingertips actually touched the gravel surface of the road. It stood perfectly still, watching my truck disappear into the night with what I somehow knew was patient amusement. And clutched in one of those elongated hands, clearly visible in the beam of my headlights, was my radio. The one that had been broadcasting those wet, breathing sounds. The one through which that voice had whispered, "Found." The creature had been holding it the entire time. When I finally made it back to the ranger station at Whitefish Lake Base, the other guys took one look at me and stopped whatever they were doing. Johnson was updating the duty roster on the whiteboard, Miller was cleaning his gear after a day patrol in the high country, and Davidson was drinking coffee and reading incident reports. All 3 of them froze like they'd seen a ghost walk through the door. I probably looked like hell. My uniform was torn in a dozen places from running through thick underbrush, my face was streaked with scratches from low-hanging branches, and I was white as the snow that crowned the peaks year-round. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, fine tremors that made it impossible to hold a pen steady or manipulate small objects without fumbling. But it was more than just physical exhaustion. Something had changed in my eyes, something that the other rangers recognized even if they couldn't name it. It was the look of someone who'd seen things that didn't fit into the neat categories we use to organize reality, who'd been forced to confront the possibility that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than we pretend it is. Jesus Christ, Martinez, Johnson said, setting down his marker and moving toward me. What the hell happened out there? You look like you've been wrestling with a grizzly. I told them the bare minimum, that I'd found signs of an abandoned campsite at Whispering Vale Lake, lost my radio during the investigation, and possibly encountered a dangerous animal. The destroyed tent, the missing camper, the tracks that didn't match any known wildlife in the area. All of that went into my preliminary report, carefully worded to sound routine and professional. But the part about the arm that stretched across 30 feet of water, the teeth breathing in the darkness, the voices coming from beneath the ground. I kept all of that to myself, locked away in a part of my mind that I hoped would eventually convince itself that it had all been hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. You learn quickly in this job that there are some things you don't put in official reports, some experiences that you keep to yourself if you want to maintain your credibility and your career. The Park Service deals in facts and evidence, not in stories that sound like they belong in a campfire tale designed to scare tourists away from venturing too far into the wilderness. Miller brought me a cup of coffee and a first aid kit, helping me clean the scratches on my face and hands while I gave them the sanitized version of my evening at Whispering Vale Lake. The hot liquid felt good in my throat, washing away some of the lingering taste of that sickly sweet smell that had seemed to permeate everything in that cursed place. We should probably get a search team out there first thing in the morning, Davidson said, already reaching for the phone to call County Search and Rescue. If there's a missing hiker, every hour counts. I nodded, though part of me already knew what they'd find. Or more accurately, what they wouldn't find. We went back in daylight the next morning, a three-man team consisting of myself, Johnson, and Rodriguez from the Search and Rescue Unit. The hike to Whispering Vale Lake took exactly the same amount of time it always had, following the Shadowmere Trail through terrain that looked completely normal in the bright Montana sunshine. The lake was calm when we arrived, its surface like a mirror reflecting the granite cliffs and the cloudless sky overhead. No ripples disturbed the water, no shadows moved beneath the surface, no strange lights pulsed in the depths. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a pristine glacial lake in one of the most beautiful wilderness areas in North America. The shoreline showed no tracks except my own from the night before, clearly preserved in the mud where I'd stood watching that impossible arm reach across the water. The impressions of my boots were exactly where they should have been, but the strange finger-like marks I'd seen, the drag patterns that had led into the forest, all of that was gone, erased as completely as if it had never existed. Johnson found my radio half buried in silt near the waterline, about 20 feet from where I remembered dropping it. The device was cracked, its antenna bent clean in half, the display screen spider-webbed with fractures that made it impossible to read. But there was no sign of how it had gotten there, no trail of evidence leading from the forest back to the water's edge. Looks like it took a pretty good beating, Rodriguez observed, turning the damaged equipment over in his hands. Must have bounced off some rocks when you dropped it. I nodded agreement, though I remembered clearly setting it down carefully when I'd first begun investigating the destroyed campsite. The damage pattern didn't match a simple fall onto forest floor, it looked more like something had deliberately crushed it, applied pressure from multiple angles until the internal components failed. We spent the rest of the morning searching for any sign of the missing camper whose tent I'd found destroyed. The area where Marcus Webb's campsite had been was completely empty, no shredded fabric, no bent tent poles, no scattered gear. The small clearing looked like it had never been occupied by human beings, just a natural gap in the forest where lightning or disease had claimed a few trees over the years. Even the driver's license I'd found was gone, vanished without a trace along with every other piece of evidence that someone named Marcus Webb had ever been to Whispering Vale Lake. When we ran the name through the system later that day, we found no missing person reports, no abandoned vehicles in the area, no record of anyone by that name purchasing camping permits or checking in at any of the area ranger stations. It was as if Marcus Webb had never existed at all. We logged the incident as an unconfirmed disturbance and recommended that the area around Whispering Vale Lake be temporarily closed to civilian access while we conducted a more thorough investigation. It was a reasonable precaution given my report of possible dangerous animal activity, and it would buy us time to figure out what, if anything, had actually happened out there. I didn't argue with the decision. In fact, I was relieved. The thought of innocent hikers stumbling into whatever was lurking in those waters made my stomach turn. Better to err on the side of caution and keep people away from Whispering Vale Lake until we could be certain it was safe. But even as we drove back toward the ranger station that afternoon, even as I filled out the paperwork and filed my official report, I knew that the story wasn't over. There were too many loose ends, too many questions that had no rational answers. And deep down, in a part of my mind that I tried not to examine too closely, I was certain that whatever I'd encountered at Whispering Vale Lake was still there, still waiting, still watching. Here's the part one haven't told anyone until now, the detail that turned my experience from a single terrifying encounter into an ongoing nightmare that has haunted me for months. 2 nights after my encounter at Whispering Vale Lake, I woke up in my cabin at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of static coming from my bedside table. The noise was soft at first, barely audible over the white noise of wind through the pine trees outside my window. But it grew steadily louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it any longer. My radio, the new one they'd given me to replace the damaged unit from the lake, was on. The power button was clearly in the off position. The display screen was dark, but sound was definitely coming from the speaker. That same empty, hissing static I'd heard at Whispering Vale Lake, like signals from the void between stars. I sat up in bed, my heart already starting to race, and reached for the device with shaking hands. But before I could turn it off, before I could convince myself that it was just some kind of electrical malfunction, the static cleared. Through the speaker came that same low, wet breathing I'd heard in the forest. The exhalation was long and controlled, followed by an inhalation that seemed to go on forever. And underneath it, barely audible, were those whispered voices again, multiple conversations in languages I didn't recognize, all happening at once in a babble of sound that made my teeth ache. Then came a single word, spoken so softly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. The word was clear, unmistakable, delivered in a voice that sounded almost human but was somehow fundamentally wrong. Still watching. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving me alone in the darkness with nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the rapid hammer of my pulse in my ears. I turned the radio over in my hands, examining it for any sign of tampering, any indication that someone had modified the device or installed some kind of remote activation system. Nothing. It was a standard Park Service radio, identical to hundreds of others in use throughout the system. There was no logical reason it should have been receiving transmissions while powered off, no technical explanation for what I'd just heard. But I knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that bypasses rational thought, that the thing from Whispering Vale Lake had found a way to reach me. Despite the miles of wilderness between my cabin and that cursed body of water, despite the walls of my home and the locked doors and the weapons I kept within easy reach, it was still watching me. And it wanted me to know. Since that night, the broadcasts have continued. Not every night, but often enough that I've stopped being surprised when that familiar static wakes me from uneasy sleep. Sometimes it's just breathing. Sometimes it's those whispered conversations in unknown languages. But occasionally, there are words in English, fragments of sentences that seem designed to let me know that whatever is out there hasn't forgotten about me. Found you. Still here. Waiting. Soon. I've considered reporting it, of course. But what would I tell them? That I'm receiving supernatural radio transmissions from a creature that shouldn't exist. That something from Whispering Vale Lake is somehow broadcasting directly to my equipment despite being miles away and presumably underwater. They'd send me for psychological evaluation faster than you could say, stress-induced paranoid delusion. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe the isolation and responsibility of wilderness work has finally gotten to me. Maybe my mind has created an elaborate fantasy to cope with the mundane reality of routine patrols and tourist management. But I don't think so. I think whatever is in Whispering Vale Lake is real, is intelligent, and is patient enough to wait for the right opportunity to finish whatever it started that night. I think Marcus Webb discovered something he shouldn't have, and I think I came far too close to sharing his fate. Most of all, I think it's still out there, watching and waiting and growing stronger. And I think that someday soon, it's going to decide that keeping me alive isn't worth the entertainment value anymore. When that day comes, I have a feeling the radio transmissions will stop. And so will I. Sand shouldn't carry sound like that. It's soft. Deadens footsteps. Muffles voices until they're barely whispers against the vastness of the Whispering Heights, the tallest peak in the entire Great Sand Dune system, where the grains shift and sing with an almost musical quality during daylight hours. But I swear, out here in the heart of the Shadowfall Basin, it's like the dunes themselves were amplifying it, the high-pitched wail of something moving fast, too fast, across the ridges that formed the amphitheater of sand surrounding this cursed valley. It was the middle of the night, no moon, and the stars were so bright they almost hurt to look at. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds, casting an ethereal glow over the undulating landscape of the Screaming Mesa, aptly named, I now realized with growing dread. I was alone on patrol, a mile from the nearest marked trail, deep in the restricted section known as the Devil's Throat, where tourists were forbidden to wander after 3 separate disappearances in the past decade. I'd been tracking a strange set of prints, small, bare feet pressed deep into the cold sand, but the stride was wrong. Way too long. The distance between each footprint suggested something with legs that could stretch impossibly far, or something that moved in bounds rather than steps. The tracks led from the edge of Serpent's Ridge down into the bowl-shaped depression locals called the Mourning Ground, where indigenous tribes once claimed the earth itself wept. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was wind. The dunes sing sometimes, a low hum when the sand shifts just right, a phenomenon scientists called booming dunes, where the friction of cascading grains creates resonant frequencies. The singing sands of the northern face were famous for it, drawing acoustic researchers from universities across the country. But this wasn't a hum. It was a scream. Long, rising, like someone falling off a cliff. Like the sound a person might make if they suddenly realized they were about to die, drawn out and distorted by distance and desperation. The cry seemed to echo off the walls of Deadman's Canyon to the east, bouncing between the towering dunes until it became a choir of anguish. And it was coming closer. I crouched low behind a wind-carved formation of hardened sand, switched off my headlamp, and tried to pinpoint the direction. It didn't matter. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, above me, behind me, from the depths of the pit of sorrows below, inside my own skull. The acoustics of the Shadowfall Basin were notorious among the ranger staff. Sound carried in impossible ways here, bouncing off the curved walls of sand, creating phantom echoes and false directions. More than one search and rescue operation had been thrown off course by voices that seemed to come from empty air. And then I saw it. A shape crested the nearest dune, the one we called Widow's Peak for its sharp, knife-like ridge. It was backlit by starlight, impossibly tall and thin, with a head tilted too far to one side, so far that it should have been anatomically impossible for any living creature. It stood still for just a second, perfectly motionless against the star-drunk sky, then dropped to all fours and ran down toward me faster than anything human should move. Its limbs moved with a spider-like fluidity, joints bending in ways that made my stomach lurch. The great sand dunes are beautiful in daylight, towering golden slopes rising 750 feet above the valley floor, with the snow-capped peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains looming in the background like ancient sentinels. The contrast is breathtaking, desert meeting alpine, impossibility made manifest in this corner of southern Colorado. But at night? They're another planet entirely. The landscape transforms after sunset, becoming something alien and hostile. Shadows pool in valleys that weren't there during the day, and the sand takes on an otherworldly luminescence that seems to glow from within. The temperature drops 40 degrees, turning the desert into a freezer that sucks the warmth from your bones. We do night patrols mostly to catch illegal campers and the occasional thrill seeker who thinks the dunes would make a good spot for unauthorized sandboarding or ATV riding. But lately, there'd been reports of strange noises coming from the deepest parts of the preserve. Screams, whispers, even singing that sounded almost like a lullaby carried on the wind. The reports had been escalating for 3 months now. First, it was just day hikers claiming they'd heard crying from the direction of the labyrinth, a maze-like section of intersecting dunes that could disorient even experienced guides. Then overnight campers in the designated camping area started complaining about sounds that kept them awake, long, mournful wails that seemed to come from beneath the sand itself. The official stance from park administration was shifting sands and wind patterns creating acoustic anomalies. We were instructed to reassure visitors that the sounds were perfectly natural phenomena, caused by the unique geology and weather patterns of the region. But more than one ranger had cut their shift short because of it, and 2 had requested transfers to other parks. I'd been skeptical myself until tonight. That night, I was covering a section near the Western Ridge, an area called the Bone Garden for the strange, skeletal formations created by wind erosion. No tourists were allowed this far out after dark. No campfires. No designated trails. Just me, my emergency pack, and miles upon miles of sand that stretched to the horizon like a frozen ocean. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and my breath came out in small puffs that were immediately swallowed by the dry air. The silence was complete, no insects, no night birds, not even the rustle of small mammals that normally populated the desert floor. It was as if the entire ecosystem had evacuated this particular corner of the preserve. The first odd thing was the tracks. I found them at the base of Sorrow's Height, the second tallest dune in the complex. Bare human feet, but tiny, like a child's, maybe size 4 or 5, spaced almost 5 feet apart in perfectly straight lines. The depth of the impression suggested significant weight, far more than a small child should carry. But the spacing was what really bothered me. I knelt down and measured with my ranger's tape. Exactly 62 inches from heel to heel, with no variation. No human being could maintain that precise a stride, especially not someone with feet that small. The physics didn't work. They went straight up the face of Sorrow's Height, a 60-degree incline that would be challenging even for an experienced climber with proper equipment. Down the other side through a section we called the Valley of Echoes, where sound bounced between parallel dune faces. And then they vanished into a flat stretch of sand near the entrance to the Tunnel of Winds, a natural passage carved between 2 massive dunes. No scatter, no signs of someone stopping to rest, no indication of the normal fatigue patterns you'd see in human tracks. Just perfectly spaced impressions that ended abruptly, as if the maker had simply evaporated. I followed them up the ridge, using my hands for balance on the steeper sections. The sand was cool under my boots, each step sinking 6 inches into the loose grains. The air was thin at this elevation. We were already at 8,200 feet above sea level, and the dunes added another 750 feet to that. Combined with the physical exertion of climbing in sand, it left me winded quickly. Halfway up the slope, I stopped to catch my breath and adjust my gear. The view from here was spectacular even in darkness, the entire Shadowfall Basin spread out below me, the other dunes rising like frozen waves in an endless sea. The meditation peaks to the north were just visible as dark silhouettes against the star field. That's when I heard it, faint at first, barely distinguishable from the whisper of wind across sand. A long, warbling cry drifting across the dunes from the direction of the Whispering Heights. It rose and fell with an almost musical quality, but there was something fundamentally wrong with the pitch and tone. It was too high for an adult human, too sustained for a child, and too complex for any animal I knew. I radioed base. Static. Not surprising, reception out here was spotty at best, blocked by the surrounding dunes and the strange magnetic properties of the sand that contained high concentrations of magnetite and other ferrous minerals. But it still made my stomach knot with unease. Protocol dictated that rangers maintain radio contact every 30 minutes during solo night patrols. The cry came again. Louder this time, with harmonics that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. And definitely closer. The second scream cut through the air so sharp it made the hairs on my arms stand up beneath my uniform sleeve. It wasn't an animal. I know the cries of coyotes, foxes, even the way wind can whistle between dunes and create sounds that almost resembled human voices. This was different. Higher, more complex, unmistakably human in origin. And yet, stretched, like it had been pulled too far to be natural. Like someone had recorded a human scream and then played it back at the wrong speed, distorting it into something that belonged in nightmares rather than the natural world. I crouched low, sweeping my LED headlamp in a slow arc across the surrounding dunes. Sand dunes play tricks on your depth perception at night, especially when you're operating with artificial light. The shadows bend and shift in ways that make the ground look closer or farther than it actually is. Distances become meaningless, and the normal visual cues that help navigate terrain become unreliable. The beam of my light revealed the familiar landscape of the Bone Garden, wind-carved formations that resembled ribs and vertebrae jutting from the sand, created by decades of erosion patterns unique to this particular microclimate. During the day, they were merely interesting geological features. At night, they looked like the skeleton of some massive beast buried just beneath the surface. I couldn't tell if the sound was coming from 50 feet away or half a mile. The acoustics of the Shadowfall Basin were notorious for distorting distance, and more than one ranger had been led astray by phantom sounds that seemed to originate from empty air. Then I spotted them again, the footprints. They hadn't been there a minute ago. Same size, same impossible spacing, just fresh. The edges were sharp and unblurred by wind, with that distinctive compression pattern that indicated recent formation. The sand around them was still slightly damp from the maker's body heat, creating tiny crystalline formations where moisture had condensed and frozen in the rapidly cooling air. And they were heading directly toward my position. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Whatever had made these tracks was not only nearby but actively moving, and it had somehow circled around to approach from a different angle while I'd been climbing. The logistics of such a maneuver would require intimate knowledge of the terrain and the ability to move through sand at incredible speed. I killed my headlamp, not wanting to make myself a target, and let my eyes adjust to the starlight. The process took several long minutes, time I wasn't sure I had, but eventually the landscape resolved into shades of silver and black. The dunes glowed faintly, their edges traced with ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the sand grains themselves. That's when I saw movement. A silhouette crested the ridge of what we called the Morning Mother, a dome-shaped dune about 200 yards to my left. It paused at the top, perfectly still, like it was studying me. Even at this distance, I could see that its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to hang from its torso at unnatural angles. Then it dropped to all fours. I've seen mountain lions move that way, fast, fluid, efficient. Their bodies are perfectly designed for that kind of locomotion, with powerful hindquarters and flexible spines that allow them to cover ground at incredible speed. But this wasn't a lion. It was too tall, its limbs too long and jointed in too many places. The way it ran was jerky, like its joints bent both directions, or like it was a marionette being operated by a drunk puppeteer. The creature descended the face of the Morning Mother in a series of bounds that defied physics, each leap covering 30 or 40 feet. Sand cascaded around it in small avalanches, but it seemed unaffected by the unstable surface that would have slowed or trapped any normal animal. I took a slow step back. My boots crunched in the sand louder than I wanted, the sound carrying in the still air with startling clarity. The thing froze mid-run, its forward momentum carrying it into a crouch at the base of the dune. Then it cocked its head to one side in a way that made my neck ache just watching it. The angle was severe, easily 90 degrees, possibly more. No vertebrate should have been able to rotate its head that far without snapping its spine. That's when it screamed again, except this time, I realized with growing horror, the sound didn't come from its mouth. It came from all around me. The scream emerged from the sand beneath my feet, from the air above my head, from the walls of the surrounding dunes. It was as if the entire landscape had become a resonating chamber, vibrating with the creature's voice. The sound waves seemed to move through the ground itself, transmitted through millions of sand grains acting as a massive acoustic network. The sound vibrated through the sand under my feet like the whole dune was resonating with it, turning the bone garden into a massive instrument played by something that shouldn't exist. I stumbled backward, clamping my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The noise wasn't just sound, it was inside my skull, reverberating through my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. The frequency was perfectly calibrated to human discomfort, hitting that sweet spot between ultrasonic and infrasonic that triggered fight-or-flight responses hardwired into our primitive brain. I felt my heart rate spike and my breathing become shallow and rapid. Panic flooded my system like ice water in my veins. When it stopped, the silence hit even harder. No wind. No rustle of shifting grains. No distant night sounds from the valley below. Just absolute, crushing quiet that pressed against my eardrums like physical weight. The transition from overwhelming noise to complete silence was so jarring that for a moment I wondered if I'd gone deaf. I switched my headlamp back on, sweeping the beam across the ridge where the figure had stood. The light revealed only empty sand, sculpted by wind into familiar patterns that looked exactly as they had before. No footprints, no disturbance, no sign that anything had ever been there. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks, that maybe I'd seen a shadow cast by one of the bizarre rock formations that occasionally jutted from the sand. The mind was capable of extraordinary self-deception when faced with the impossible, and isolation could trigger hallucinations in even the most stable individuals. But then the footprints reappeared. Not ahead of me where I'd been tracking them. Around me. A perfect circle of small, bare tracks, each one pressed deep into the sand with that same 62-inch spacing, forming a ring maybe 20 feet across with me at the exact center. The impressions were so fresh that grains were still settling into them, creating tiny avalanches that caught the light from my headlamp like falling stars. They hadn't been there seconds ago. I was absolutely certain of that. I'd been standing in this exact spot for at least 5 minutes, and the ground around me had been completely unmarked. There was no way something could have circled me without my knowledge, especially not in sand that would have shown every footstep and revealed every movement. Unless it could move without touching the ground. The thought sent fresh waves of adrenaline through my system. I stepped over the circle of tracks and started back toward the ranger station, moving fast but trying not to outright run. Running would only confirm that something was chasing me, and I wasn't ready to accept that reality yet. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder. The dunes looked the same, soft hills rolling into darkness, familiar formations that I'd navigated dozens of times during daylight hours. But that's the thing about the dunes, they hide anything you don't want to see. Valleys that are invisible from one angle become obvious from another. Ridges that seem solid can conceal entire canyons behind them. The landscape was a constantly shifting maze where the rules of normal geography didn't apply. I made it maybe 100 yards before the ground gave out beneath me. 1 second I was walking on what seemed like solid, packed sand, the next I was sliding, sand pouring down around me as I tumbled into a hidden hollow that hadn't been visible from above. The depression was perfectly circular, about 30 feet across and maybe 12 feet deep, like a crater that had been carved into the desert by some tremendous impact. I landed hard at the bottom, sand filling my boots and gloves, the fine grains working their way into every crease of my clothing. When I looked up, trying to get my bearings, I realized the walls of the depression were too steep and too loose to climb quickly. The sand kept cascading down whenever I tried to gain purchase, like a bowl designed specifically to hold me in place. And I wasn't alone. Something moved at the rim above me. Just a silhouette against the star field, head cocked at that impossible angle, arms dangling so low that what looked like fingertips brushed the sand at the edge of the depression. It didn't come down. It just stood there. Watching. The waiting was somehow worse than active pursuit. I could feel its attention like weight pressing down on me, could sense its alien intelligence evaluating my situation with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. Then, more screams. Not one, but many, from all directions. The echoes bounced off the walls of my sandy prison and twisted until I couldn't tell where they originated. Some seemed to come from directly overhead. Others appeared to emerge from beneath the sand I was standing on. A few sounded like they were coming from inside my own head. Shapes moved along the rim, more silhouettes, their heads tilting in perfect synchronization like a chorus line of nightmares. I counted 3, then 4, then 5. Each one maintained that same impossible posture, necks bent at angles that should have been fatal. They formed a perfect circle around the depression, spaced with mathematical precision. Waiting. I counted 3 shapes along the rim at first. Then 4. Then 5. Then more, so many that they began to blur together in the starlight, creating a ring of watchers around my sandy prison. Each new arrival moved with that same spider-like fluidity, joints bending in ways that hurt to observe. They didn't move like people, no shifting weight from foot to foot, no unconscious swaying or fidgeting. Just perfect stillness, as if they were carved from the darkness itself. But their heads never stopped moving, tilting and rotating to track my every movement with mechanical precision. I took one slow step back toward what I hoped was the lowest wall of the depression. My boots sank into the loose sand with soft crunching sounds that seemed amplified in the enclosed space. Immediately, all the figures tilted their heads further, so far that it looked like their necks would snap under the strain. One of them twitched, a sudden, insect-like jerk that ran through its entire body like an electrical shock. Then it slid down the slope toward me without bending its knees, maintaining perfect vertical posture as it descended. Sand flowed around it like water, creating no resistance, offering no impediment to its impossible locomotion. I turned and bolted toward the far side of the depression, scrambling at the sand with my hands and boots. Every time I managed to gain a few feet of elevation, the loose grains gave way under my weight, sending me sliding back toward the bottom. My gloves filled with sand, and the fine particles worked their way into my mouth and nose, making it difficult to breathe. Behind me, the sliding sound got louder, not just one creature now, but several, descending the walls of the depression in that same uncanny manner. The sound was like rain on a tin roof, millions of sand grains cascading and shifting as impossible bodies moved through them without displacement. Then came the scream. Not loud this time, not the overwhelming assault on my senses that I'd experienced before. This was different. Soft, almost intimate, like a whisper spoken directly into my ear. Right behind me. I spun around, sand flying from my gloves and boots. The creature was inches away from my face. Up close, it was even more terrible than I'd imagined. The figure was tall, maybe 8 feet if it had stood straight, but hunched, its spine forming a long, crooked arc like a question mark made of bone and shadow. Its limbs were impossibly thin, barely more than stick-like appendages that seemed to bend in 3 or 4 places where normal arms and legs would have only 2 joints. But it was the face that froze my blood in my veins. Where its features should have been was smooth, like stretched hide or melted wax. No eyes, no nose, no expression of any kind. Just a blank expanse of flesh-colored material that seemed to shift and flow in the starlight. And where its mouth should have been, was a hole. A perfectly round, black void that pulsed with each breath the creature took. The opening was maybe 4 inches across, lined with what looked like rows of tiny teeth arranged in concentric circles, like the mouth of some deep-sea creature that had never seen sunlight. The scream came again, and I realized it wasn't just sound emanating from that hole. It was pulling at me. The sand under my boots began to shift and flow toward the creature's mouth void, dragging me forward in tiny, unstoppable slides. My bootlaces came undone on their own, pulled by the inexorable suction. Loose sand from my gloves and clothing flew through the air in thin streams, disappearing into the darkness of that impossible throat. I dropped to my knees, digging my hands deep into the sand, trying to find purchase on something solid beneath the loose surface layer. But my gloves found nothing, just more sand, finer and finer grains that poured through my fingers like water. The entire floor of the depression seemed to be flowing toward the creature, and me along with it. The hole widened as I drew closer, the concentric rings of teeth becoming more visible. They weren't stationary, they rotated slowly, grinding against each other with a sound like glass breaking. The void beyond them was absolute, a darkness so complete it seemed to pull at the light itself. Other creatures had reached the bottom of the depression now, forming a loose circle around me and their companion. Their mouth holes opened in unison, creating a chorus of suction that pulled at me from multiple directions. Sand flew through the air in spiraling streams, and I felt my body being drawn inexorably toward the center of their formation. I don't remember deciding to do it, instinct just took over, bypassing conscious thought entirely. My hand found the emergency flare on my belt, muscle memory guiding my fingers to the striker cap. I yanked it free and struck it hard against the rough surface, and the sudden red light exploded in the depression like a miniature sun. The creature directly in front of me recoiled as if it had been struck by a physical blow. The hole in its face snapped shut with a wet sound, like a wound healing in fast motion. Its entire body convulsed, limbs flailing in apparent agony as it scrambled backward up the wall of the depression. The others on the rim jerked back at the same time, their heads whipping upright with synchronized precision. The collective intake of breath, or whatever passed for breathing among these things, created a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel. I scrambled up the slope on the opposite side, the flare clutched tight in my fist. The red light carved a path through the darkness, and wherever it touched, the sand seemed to solidify, giving me purchase that had been impossible moments before. Behind me, I could hear the creatures retreating, their movements creating avalanches of displaced sand that filled the depression with a continuous roar. By the time I crested the rim and looked back, the hollow was empty. No footprints. No drag marks. No sign that anything had ever been there except for a perfectly circular depression in the sand that could have been caused by wind erosion over decades. But I knew better now. The Bone Garden, the Shadowfall Basin, the entire network of dunes that made up this cursed landscape, they were hunting grounds. And something that shouldn't exist was using them to feed. I didn't stop moving until the dunes gave way to the flat, hard-packed maintenance road leading back to the Windstone Station, the remote ranger outpost that served as headquarters for night operations in the preserve's most isolated sectors. Even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those impossible silhouettes following me across the moonlit landscape. The flare continued to burn in my hand, casting everything in hellish red light that made the familiar terrain look alien and threatening. I'd never been so grateful for artificial illumination in my life. The steady chemical flame was a barrier between me and the darkness, a shield that the creatures couldn't or wouldn't cross. When I reached the station, my partner, Carla, was waiting by the reinforced steel door. She'd been monitoring radio frequencies all night, growing increasingly concerned when my scheduled check-ins failed to come through. She took one look at me, covered in sand from head to toe, the spent flare still clutched in my death grip, my eyes probably wild with residual terror, and her face went pale. Jesus Christ, what happened out there? I told her everything. The footprints that appeared and disappeared without warning. The impossible stride length that defied human anatomy. The creature that moved like a spider but stood like a man. The chorus of screams that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself. The depression that had trapped me like a funnel web, and the things with holes for mouths that had tried to draw me into some unspeakable darkness. She didn't laugh. Didn't tell me I'd imagined it, or that isolation and exhaustion could play tricks on the mind, or any of the rational explanations that part of me desperately wanted to hear. Instead, she walked to the back office, a cramped space lined with filing cabinets and emergency equipment, and pulled out an old cardboard storage box that had been gathering dust on the highest shelf. The box was labeled Incident Reports, archived in faded handwriting that looked decades old. She slid it across the metal desk with a sound like fingernails on slate. Inside were 6 emergency flares, their casings blackened and scarred from use, along with a weathered, leather-bound journal that looked like it had survived a war. The binding was cracked, and many of the pages were stained with what might have been sand, or sweat, or something worse. "Read the first page," Carla said, her voice barely above a whisper. The entry was dated September 15, 1973, written in careful block letters with a fountain pen that had begun to skip and fade. Night Patrol, Section 7, Bone Garden Vicinity. Observed unusual footprint formations, bare human feet, child-sized, impossible spacing. Stride length approximately 60 to 65 inches. Tracks appeared and disappeared without explanation. Encountered humanoid figures with anomalous anatomy and acoustic capabilities. Creatures demonstrated predatory behavior and apparent sensitivity to bright light. Emergency flare proved effective deterrent. Recommend immediate reclassification of Section 7 as restricted area. Note, this is the 3rd documented encounter in 6 months. Previous reports filed with Park Administration resulted in transfer requests and medical leave recommendations. Pattern suggests ongoing threat to personnel. Whatever inhabits the deep dunes is not natural, not human, and not going away. They never stop screaming. The signature at the bottom was barely legible, but I could make out the name, Ranger Marcus Webb. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Missing, October 12, 1973. Body never recovered." I flipped through more pages, finding similar reports dated throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Different handwriting, different rangers, but the same impossible details repeated with eerie consistency. The small footprints. The wrong stride length. The creatures that moved like spiders and screamed like the damned. And always, the same recommendation, emergency flares as the only effective deterrent. The final entry was dated just 2 years ago. Section 7 patrol suspended indefinitely following Ranger Martinez incident. Request formal investigation by outside authorities. These things are getting bolder. Last night they came within 50 yards of the station itself. I could see them through the windows, standing in perfect formation around the perimeter. Waiting. Management continues to classify reports as stress-induced hallucinations. They're wrong. The Bone Garden is hunting ground, and we're the prey. God help whoever draws the next night shift. I looked up at Carla, who was watching my face with the expression of someone who'd carried a terrible secret for too long. How many people know about this? A few of the senior staff. Most of the old-timers requested transfers years ago. The ones who stayed. She gestured at the journal. Well, you can see what happened to them. And management? Officially, these reports don't exist. Unofficially, they're buried so deep in bureaucratic red tape that nobody asks questions anymore. It's easier to blame stress and isolation than admit we might have a real problem. I thought about the creatures surrounding the depression, their perfect formation and synchronized movements. The way they'd retreated from the flare but hadn't fled entirely, just pulled back to a safe distance, waiting for the light to fade. They're not going anywhere, are they? Carla shook her head. The reports go back 50 years, maybe more. We only started keeping detailed records in the 70s. Before that. She shrugged. Local tribes have stories about things that live in the deep sand. Things that steal voices and drag souls into the earth. We always assumed they were just legends. I stared out the station's reinforced windows at the dunes beyond, their surfaces silver and peaceful in the starlight. In a few hours, the sun would rise and transform the landscape back into the stunning natural wonder that drew thousands of visitors each year. Families would hike the established trails, children would play in the shallows of Medano Creek, and photographers would capture the beauty of the shifting sands against the backdrop of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. But after dark, the dunes belonged to something else. Something that had been waiting in the deep places long before the first human ever set foot in this valley. Something that screamed with voices stolen from the darkness, and fed on whatever stumbled into its domain. What do we do now? I asked. Carla closed the journal and returned it to the box, sealing away decades of terror and officially sanctioned denial. We keep the flares handy, she said. We stay out of Section 7 after sunset. And we pray that whatever lives out there stays hungry for something other than park rangers. Outside, carried on the cold desert wind, came a sound that might have been the night breeze moving across sand. Or it might have been screaming. The dunes of the Shadowfall Basin kept their secrets, but they never stopped singing. And somewhere in that vast expanse of shifting sand and starlight, ancient hunters waited for their next opportunity to feed. The red emergency flare on my belt felt reassuringly heavy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that light was only a temporary deterrent, not a permanent solution. In the morning, I would file my report and request reassignment to a different section of the park. But tonight, I would sit by the window and watch the dunes, making sure nothing with impossible proportions and holes for mouths came too close to the Windstone Station. Because in the deep places of the Bone Garden, where the sand sang with stolen voices and the darkness moved with purpose, something was always listening. And it was always hungry. Trees shouldn't breathe. But that's the only way I can describe it, the way the trunk swelled, just slightly, in and out, like the forest itself was a single, colossal lung. It was a slow, deep, terrifyingly organic rhythm, a motion that belonged to flesh and blood, not ancient wood. It was 2 a.m, and I was halfway up a maintenance trail that only 3 rangers, myself included, even knew existed. No hikers. No cabins. No comforting glow of a distant town. Just endless, suffocating walls of Douglas firs and western hemlocks, their tops vanishing into an impenetrable, starless dark. The air was thin and cold, sharp in my lungs with the scent of pine and damp earth. I was answering a call I shouldn't have answered. A call that defied every law of physics and reason. A voice on my radio, faint, broken by static, like a ghost on the wire, saying, "Help me. Please." The thing is, the voice belonged to a ranger who'd been dead for 12 years. Dave Miller. A good man, a friend, who had walked into this very section of the park and never walked out. I stopped on the trail, my own breath fogging in the beam of my headlamp. The world was utterly silent. No owls, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The silence was a presence in itself, heavy and expectant. The pines swayed, a gentle, hypnotic dance, though there was no wind. They moved with that same internal, living cadence as the breathing trunks. And then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, came the sound of wood splintering, slow, deliberate, like something massive was testing its strength, pulling a tree apart fiber by fiber. It wasn't the clean crack of a falling branch, it was a tearing, groaning sound that scraped at my nerves. I raised my high-lumen flashlight, sweeping its beam through the oppressive darkness. That was my mistake. The light didn't just illuminate trees. It caught dozens of faces staring back at me from the bark, human faces, their features perfectly rendered in the rough texture of the wood. They were embedded, not carved, their eyes shut as if in sleep, their mouths moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. They were on every trunk, a silent, watching congregation. And one of them opened its eyes. Olympic National Park is big, bigger than most people realize. Over 900,000 acres of raw, untamed wilderness. It's a place of impossible greens and deep, misty blues, where temperate rainforests drip with moss and the mountains still hold glaciers. But for all its postcard beauty, there are parts of it that are so dense, so overgrown and fundamentally primeval, that even seasoned rangers avoid them. We call them the blank spots on the map, areas where compasses sometimes spin and the silence feels less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. The section I was in that night, the Quinault Highlands, wasn't on any visitor map. It used to be a fire lookout route back in the 40s, but the tower had rotted and collapsed long before I joined the service. The trail itself had been mostly reclaimed by the forest, a faint scar of packed earth hidden beneath a blanket of pine needles and ferns. We used it for little more than accessing a remote weather station sensor, a task that fell to me once a month. My name is Leo. I've been a ranger here for 15 years. I'm not prone to flights of fancy. I believe in what I can see, touch, and explain. A bear is a bear. A storm is a storm. I've faced down cougars and spent nights lost in blizzards. I thought I knew fear. That night, I was supposed to be at the main station, cozied up with a lukewarm coffee while logging overnight weather data. The shift was blessedly dull. The main radio hummed with quiet efficiency, a comforting link to the civilized world. Then, just after midnight, a secondary frequency, one rarely used, crackled to life. It was weak, cutting in and out, the signal so degraded it was more static than voice. KSSHK, this is, HHHK, Dave, anyone, copy, help me. I froze, my hand hovering over the logbook. Dave. Dave Miller. He'd been my training officer when I was a rookie. A lanky, grizzled man with a dry wit and a deep, abiding respect for the woods that had eventually claimed him. He went missing in the fall of 2011. We mounted the largest search in the park's history. Found his truck at the trailhead of this very route, still packed for an overnight shift. We found a boot print. That was it. He was declared dead 2 years later. My first thought was that it was a prank. Some kids with a powerful ham radio messing around. Or maybe a garbled transmission from another park, another ranger named Dave. But the voice, it had the same tired, gravelly rasp Dave always got at the end of a long shift. The same slight Washington drawl. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 12 years, but one I'd never forgotten. Against my better judgment, I answered. Unidentified station, this is Ranger Station Foxtrot. Please repeat your transmission. The only reply was a burst of static, then silence. I tried again. Nothing. My commanding officer was on leave. The night duty roster was just me. Protocol demanded I log it as an anomaly and wait for confirmation. But it was Dave's voice. If there was a 1 in a billion chance it was him, that he'd been out there all this time, a hermit, injured. I couldn't just sit there. The thought was insane, but the voice was real. I geared up, a knot of ice in my stomach. Extra batteries for the radio and flashlight, a medical kit, my service pistol, and a small, razor-sharp hatchet that was always on my belt. I logged my destination in the official record, investigating anomalous radio signal, Old Lookout Trail. ETA back at station, 0600. I hoped it would sound routine to anyone who read it. It felt like anything but. The drive to the trailhead was silent, the asphalt giving way to gravel and finally to a dirt track swallowed by ferns. I left my truck where Dave's had been found all those years ago. The moment I stepped out, the air changed. It was colder here, heavier. The dense canopy of the firs blotted out the sky, creating a darkness that felt tangible, like black felt. I switched on my headlamp and started walking. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. First, the distant call of an owl ceased. Then the chirping of crickets faded away, as if I'd crossed an invisible barrier. By the time I was an hour in, the only sound in the entire world was the soft crunch of my boots on the damp pine needles. The silence was absolute, a perfect vacuum. Then the forest started breathing. When I say the forest was breathing, I don't mean the gentle, poetic way a breeze ripples through leaves. This was visceral, mechanical, and deeply wrong. I mean the trunks of the colossal Douglas firs that lined the trail swelled and contracted in a slow, synchronized rhythm. The rough bark strained, the fissures deepening and then shallowing as the wood expanded and then relaxed, like muscle under skin. It was a slow, deep thrum, a vibration I felt more in the bones of my feet than heard with my ears. At first, I told myself my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd been hiking with just the focused beam of my headlamp for over an hour, and fatigue coupled with sensory deprivation can do bizarre things to your perception. It had to be a trick of the light, the way my narrow beam moved over the curved surfaces of the trunks. I stopped, planting my feet, and held the light steady on a single, massive fir. It swelled. A slow, deliberate expansion that made the bark groan softly. Then it contracted. My heart, which had been a steady drum, began to hammer against my ribs. I was about to dismiss it as a hallucination, a sign I needed to turn back and get some sleep, when my scientific curiosity, or perhaps morbid foolishness, took over. I reached out a gloved hand and pressed it against the trunk. The bark was warm. Not sun-warm, but body-warm. And beneath my palm, I felt it. A slow, steady pulse. Thump-thump, thump-thump. It was the pulse of something impossibly vast and ancient. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. The rational part of my brain was screaming, a panicked litany of explanations, geothermal activity, seismic tremors, a full-blown psychotic break. But the primal, animal part of me knew better. It knew what it had felt. It felt life. I was turning around, every instinct now screaming at me to run, when the radio on my shoulder crackled again, loud and sharp in the suffocating silence. "Help me." It was Dave's voice, but it was different this time. Clearer. The static was almost gone. And it was closer. Far too close. The signal strength was strong, impossibly so, as if the source was just a few hundred yards up the trail. Before, it had sounded like a distant echo. Now, it sounded like he was whispering right into the microphone. Logic had officially left the building. My mission was no longer about a potential rescue, it was about confronting an impossibility. I followed the voice deeper into the pines, my feet moving as if pulled by a string. Each step was an argument with myself, a battle between ingrained duty and raw, gut-wrenching terror. The air grew damp and thick, clinging to my skin like a wet shroud. It started to smell of ozone and rich, decaying loam, with a cloying sweet undertone of resin. My boots, which had been crunching on pine needles, now sank into moss so thick and unnaturally lush it swallowed the sound of my steps. I was moving in complete silence again, a ghost in a living wood. Then I saw the first face. It was on a hemlock to my right, at perfect eye level. It wasn't a carving, and it wasn't a coincidental pattern in the bark. It was in the bark, the features seamlessly integrated with the wood grain, as if someone had been pressed into the tree while it was sapling soft, and the forest had grown up around them, absorbing them. The features were disturbingly perfect, a strong nose, thin lips, closed eyelids that looked paper-thin. I could see the faint, feathery lines of eyebrows, the delicate curve of a nostril. It was a man's face, frozen in an expression of serene resignation. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam swinging wildly across the trail. The light caught another face on the next tree. And another. And another. They were everywhere. Dozens of them, on every side, all at chest height, all facing the trail. Men, women, their features distinct and individual. Some looked peaceful. Others were contorted in silent agony, their mouths open in a scream the wood had swallowed. And every single one had its mouth moving, a slow, continuous chewing motion. Like they were trying to speak but no sound could escape. They were a silent, pleading, horrifying chorus. I kept moving forward, my body on autopilot, because the radio kept calling to me, reeling me in. The static was a thick hiss now, Dave's voice breaking through it in desperate, fractured pleas. Almost there, KSSHHK, Leo, don't stop. He used my name. I didn't realize my hands were shaking until I nearly dropped my flashlight. My fingers felt numb, my knuckles white as I gripped the cold metal. The breathing of the trees was deeper now, the pulses stronger, and the silent chewing of the faces in the bark seemed to grow more frantic. The faces followed me. Not by literally turning their wooden heads, that would have been a mercy. Instead, the forest repeated them. Every few trees, I'd see the same serene man, the same screaming woman, their expressions a recurring nightmare woven into the fabric of this place. It was as if the woods had a limited number of stolen souls in its gallery and was displaying them on a loop. The ground began to slope steeply upward, the trail narrowing into a tight channel between the pulsing trunks. The trees grew closer together, their upper branches interlocking to form a dense, black ceiling. My headlamp beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just a few feet ahead. It felt like I was climbing into the throat of some great beast. Halfway up the rise, I caught movement in the periphery of my vision. A flicker of motion, quick and unnatural. I swung the beam towards it, nothing but the endless, grooved bark of the firs. I held the light still, heart pounding, listening. The only sound was the thrumming of the wood. Then, just as I started to lower the flashlight, I saw it again. Something was darting between the trees at the edge of my light, fast and low to the ground. It was no animal I recognized. I caught only fleeting glimpses, the flash of a pale, spindly arm, the blur of a body weaving through the trunks with the fluidity of a snake. It was too fast to be human, too thin to be a bear. Dave? I called out, my voice cracking, sounding pathetic and small in the immense, breathing quiet. The thing stopped. The frantic movement ceased. The entire forest seemed to go still, holding its breath in unison with the entity I couldn't see. For a moment, the pulsing of the trunks even seemed to pause. There was only a profound, listening silence. And then the radio on my shoulder spoke, but this time, it wasn't Dave's voice. It was mine. Keep going, it said, a perfect, digital replication of my own voice, complete with my cadence, my intonation. I froze solid, a spike of ice-cold adrenaline shooting up my spine. My finger hovered over the transmit button on my handset, but I hadn't touched it. I hadn't said a word. And yet, my own voice came from the speaker again, calm and reassuring. It's safe up ahead. I'm waiting for you. No, it wasn't. I didn't know how I knew, but every nerve in my body, every primal instinct I possessed from a million years of evolution, was screaming at me, trap, trap, trap. The voice was a lure. Dave's voice was a lure. This whole place was a lure. Something brushed against my arm. I whipped around with a cry, the beam of my light cutting a frantic arc through the dark. There was nothing there. Only the trunk of a Douglas fir pressed up against the narrow trail, with a face on it. The face of the serene man. But its eyes were open now. And they were looking right at me. They were wet, glassy, and impossibly human, and they were filled with an ancient, knowing sorrow. The eyes in the bark didn't blink. They just stared, glassy and wet with some internal fluid, reflecting my headlamp's beam in two tiny, terrifying points of light. They weren't looking in my general direction, they were focused on me, tracking my every tremor. The serene expression was gone, replaced by a look of stark, desperate warning. The mouth moved faster now, lips stretching and contorting around words I couldn't hear but could almost understand through the sheer intensity of the gaze. Go back. I took a clumsy step backward, the pine needles and moss crunching loudly under my boots. That single sound was a trigger. In a horrifying, cascading ripple, every face around me opened its eyes at once. Snap. 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 The sound was like dry twigs breaking, but it came from dozens of eyelids made of wood. First the ones nearest me, then the ones further back, their lids snapping up in near-perfect, ghastly unison. Dozens of pairs of wet, shining eyes, all locking on me. Every mouth was now forming different silent syllables, a cacophony of unheard pleas and warnings. The air grew heavy, warm, and suffocatingly humid, the sweet smell of resin becoming so thick it was choking. It coated the back of my throat, a taste of pine and panic. Then the voices came. Not out loud. Not through the radio. They bloomed inside my head. A tidal wave of whispers, overlapping, scratching, clawing over each other to be heard. It was a storm of consciousness, 100 minds speaking at once. Help us. It hurts. It always hurts in the wood. 12 years, so long in the dark. Don't look behind you. He'll make you part of the chorus. Run. Of course I looked. My headlamp beam sliced back down the trail I'd just climbed. Something was standing in the path. It was tall, taller than any person should be, its gaunt shoulders brushing the low-hanging branches 10 feet up. Its body was impossibly thin, a stick figure of a man built from peeled logs and knotted roots, jointed all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow. Its skin looked like fresh bark stripped from a tree, pale and fibrous in some places, dark and wet in others, glistening with sap. Its head was a featureless ovoid of smooth, pale wood, except for a single, gaping mouth. A vertical slit, jagged and black like a deep tear in the wood, that stretched from where its chin should be to the top of its head. It took a step forward, and the sound was the groaning splinter of wood I had heard earlier. And as it moved, the forest moved with it. The trees leaned in, their trunks groaning in sympathy, the faces in their bark twisting in expressions of shared pain. I tried to run, to scramble back up the slope, but the ground softened beneath my boots, turning from firm earth to a sucking, wet mire. My feet sank ankle deep, then calf deep, and the thick, living moss began to pulse, pulling me down with a cold, inexorable strength. The thing didn't walk toward me, it grew. Each step it took wasn't a step, but an extension. Its limbs elongated, stretching with a sound of cracking fibers. Its head rose higher and higher into the canopy until I was staring up into that ragged, black, silent mouth. It was the forest's will-given form, its ancient, hungry consciousness made manifest. It leaned down, its whole torso bending at an impossible angle, until its featureless face was inches from mine. I could smell the rot and the sweet resin coming from its void-like mouth. And then, it spoke. Not with a voice, but with the forest itself. The pines shuddered violently, their branches rattling like bones. The ground trembled. And every single face in the bark, every pair of staring, captive eyes, swiveled to look at me, and every mouth moved in perfect, horrific synchrony, shaping the same word. The sound came from the groaning wood, the wind in the needles, the vibration in the soil. It was a single, resonant, all-encompassing command. Stay. The moss surged up around my legs, wrapping around my thighs like cold, wet ropes, pulling me down into the earth. I clawed at it, my gloves coming away with fistfuls of slimy green, but it was like fighting the ground itself. I was being absorbed, just like the faces in the trees. I was being planted. A face in the trunk I was being pulled against screamed, a silent, gaping wail of terror for me, and I felt something hard push against my back from inside the tree. Splinters. Hands. I didn't think. I just reacted. Primal terror took over. I ripped the hatchet from my belt and swung it with all my strength. The blade bit deep into the trunk of the tree beside me, right into the screaming face. The sound was a wet thunk. And the entire forest shrieked. It was a sound that was both auditory and psychic, a high-frequency blast of pure agony that pierced my skull. Every face in the bark convulsed, mouth stretched into impossibly wide O's, eyes rolling back to show whites. The tall thing, the Sylvan, staggered back, its long limbs trembling as if it had taken a physical blow. It was all connected. The trees, the faces, the creature, it was one being. I roared, a sound of pure defiance, and swung the hatchet again, burying it even deeper into the wounded trunk. Sap, thick and dark as blood, sprayed from the gash. The whispers in my head cut off as if a switch had been flipped. The moss around my legs went limp and lifeless, falling away from my boots. The ground firmed up beneath me. I didn't wait to see if it would last. I ripped my hatchet free and ran. The forest chased me. Not with footsteps, but with coordinated, malevolent motion. Branches thick as my arms snapped and whipped down, trying to clothesline me. Roots tore up from the ground, erupting in tangled snares to block my path. The trees themselves seemed to shift, closing the trail ahead of me. I hacked and stumbled, adrenaline singing in my veins, heart pounding a rhythm of pure flight. The air was filled with the sound of cracking, groaning wood, the angry tantrum of a wounded god. I didn't look back. I just ran, my lungs burning, until I burst through the final line of trees and stumbled out into the open air of the trailhead. The world was blessedly normal. There was my truck, solid and real under the faint moonlight that managed to pierce the clouds here. I don't remember fumbling for my keys or opening the door, just the beautiful, final sound of it slamming shut and the engine roaring to life. As I threw the truck into gear and tore away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Back at the edge of the woods, the line of towering pines swayed in a wind that wasn't there. And for just a second, I saw them. Dozens of faces, pressed against the trunks from the inside, their wet eyes watching me leave. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that refused to acknowledge my terror. The sky was a crisp, clear blue. The birds were singing. The world felt aggressively, offensively normal. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the wet, staring eyes and the wood and the black, jagged mouth of the thing that called itself the forest. I drove back out to that same trailhead with two other rangers, Mark and Sarah. I told them a heavily edited version of the story, that I'd been investigating the strange radio signal, got disoriented, and thought I saw some unsettling things in the dark. I left out the breathing trees, the psychic voices, and the tall, bark-skinned creature. I knew how it would sound. In the bright, unflinching light of day, the old Lookout Trail looked like any other. A peaceful, green path winding through majestic, silent trees. There were no faces in the bark. No sense of a breathing presence. The trunks were cool and solid to the touch. The thick moss where I'd been trapped was just ordinary ground cover, cool and springy underfoot, showing no signs of disturbance. We found the tree I'd attacked. It was the same massive Douglas fir, in the same spot by the upward slope. I could identify it by the unique pattern of its branches. But the wound, the deep, double gash from my hatchet, was gone. The bark was smooth, seamless, and ancient. There was no scar, no sap, no sign it had ever been struck. Mark clapped me on the shoulder. "Leo, you look like hell. You sure you didn't just have a waking nightmare? Been working too many night shifts. You breathe in enough pine resin and mold spores out here, your brain can play some serious tricks on you." Sarah nodded in agreement. "He's right. This place is eerie enough in daylight. I can't imagine being up here alone at 2 a.m. chasing a ghost on the radio." I laughed along with them, a hollow, rattling sound. I let them believe it. What was the alternative? Report, investigated anomalous signal, found nothing. Suspect equipment malfunction and ranger fatigue. The truth wasn't something that could be filed in a report. The truth wasn't something the sane world had a category for. They found no evidence because the evidence was the forest itself, and it had simply healed. That night, I tried to sleep, but sleep offered no escape. I dreamed I was back in the forest, standing on the silent path. The slow, deep breathing started again, a rhythmic pressure in the dream air. The whispers slithered back into my mind, clearer this time. "You heard us. You carry our scent now. You cannot leave us behind." In the dream, I turned, and the tall, bark-skinned thing was standing not on the trail, but just inside my bedroom door, its long limbs bent to fit under the frame, its jagged mouth a slash of perfect black in the familiar shadows of my home. I woke up with a jolt, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was empty. But the air was thick with the cloying, sweet smell of pine resin. And there, on my nightstand, sitting starkly on the dark wood next to my alarm clock, was a single, fresh, green pine needle. It hadn't been there when I went to bed. I haven't been back to the old Lookout Trail. I traded shifts, I feigned illness, I did whatever I could to avoid that section of the park. But the feeling never left me. Sometimes, when I'm driving home, I see the trees lining the road, and for a split second, I think I see their trunks swell. Sometimes, in a crowd, I hear a whisper that isn't there. The forest knows my name. It knows where I live. It gave me a souvenir, a small reminder that a part of it is now with me, and a part of me, I fear, was left behind in that dark, breathing wood, another silent face waiting for the bark to grow over. Dave Miller wasn't the first. The entity on the trail wanted to make sure I wasn't the last. I escaped, but I'm not free. The whispering pines don't forget. Spend enough time out here, and you stop thinking of land as the default. You start seeing it for what it is, a temporary interruption of the water, a place for things to dry out before the wet inevitably reclaims them. The Everglades swallows miles of Florida, and in summer, it feels like you're walking through the mouth of something alive, hot, damp, and breathing slowly. The air is so thick with moisture it's like a physical weight, a wet wool blanket you can't shrug off. Your skin is never truly dry. Your lungs burn with the effort of pulling oxygen from the soupy atmosphere. I've been a ranger here for 6 years. My name is Sam Calloway. Most people who come through, the tourists in their air-conditioned cars on the main park road, think the Everglades is all gators and snakes, dangerous, sure, but predictable. They see the postcard version, the elegant egret, the sunning reptile. They don't know about the other things that live in the water. The ones that don't breathe. The ones that wait. 2 summers ago, I pulled a canoe out to check reports of an abandoned camp. It was deep in the backcountry, a place you can only get to by navigating the labyrinthine water trails that snake through the mangrove forests. No big deal, tourists sometimes get spooked by a gator sighting or the sheer oppressive silence and leave their stuff behind. But when I got there, the camp was too neat. The tent was still standing, zipped up tight. The fire ring held a small pile of gray ash that was still warm to the touch. And all 3 sleeping bags inside the tent were zipped up tight, too, forming 3 distinct, human-shaped lumps on the tent floor. Inside each one was a body. White, bloated, and dripping, as if they'd been pulled from the bottom of a canal moments before. Their skin was the color of spoiled milk, their features swollen and indistinct. The smell was of rot and stagnant water. The weird part? There was no water anywhere near camp. The ground was cracked and dry, baked hard by a week of relentless sun. The nearest channel was 100 yards away through a thicket of sawgrass and mangrove roots. There wasn't a single muddy footprint, not a drop of water on the tent floor. They were just wet. Impossibly, horrifyingly wet. We never found out what happened. The coroner's report was a mess of contradictions. Drowning was the cause of death, but the bodies showed no signs of being moved post-mortem. It was logged as a mystery, one of the many strange files that end up in the park's cold case archives. I tried to forget it. But out here, the water remembers everything. The report that started this new, personal nightmare came in from a birdwatcher named Mrs. Kinley. She was a regular, a retired schoolteacher from Naples with a telephoto lens the size of a cannon. She knew the park's rhythms, its quiet corners. She called dispatch, her voice a little shaky, reporting a bright green tent on a hammock, a small island of dry land, deep in the mangrove flats of the 10,000 Islands region. She'd been taking photos of a roseate spoonbill when she spotted it through her lens. It looked odd, she said. No NPS permit tag clipped to the tent pole, no visible canoe or kayak pulled up on the bank. Just the tent, sitting there silent and out of place. It had been there for at least 2 days, she was sure of it. Dispatch logged it as a possible abandoned campsite and welfare check. Given the remote location and the fact that it was a weekday with staff stretched thin, they told me to check it out solo. Probably just some weekenders who packed out in a hurry and forgot their tent, Sam, my supervisor, Dave, had said over the radio. Just tag it and we'll figure out retrieval later. The route was a familiar misery. I launched my canoe from the ranger station at Chokoloskee Bay and paddled into the oppressive stillness of the backcountry. The tide was going out, pulling the water from the mangrove roots and exposing slick, gray mud that smelled of sulfur and decay. The air was a living cloud of whine and sting, mosquitoes descended in tactical squadrons the moment my paddle strokes ceased. I wore a long-sleeved shirt, gloves, and a head net, but I could feel them probing for any millimeter of exposed skin. It took nearly 2 hours of weaving through the narrow water channels to get to the coordinates Mrs. Kinley had provided. The world became a monotonous tunnel of green and brown. Overhead, the mangrove canopy blotted out the sky, plunging the waterway into a humid twilight. Sunlight struggled through in dappled, shifting patches. The only sounds were the dip and pull of my paddle, the gentle slap of water against the canoe's hull, and the incessant, maddening hum of insects. It's a sound that works its way inside your skull, a high-frequency drill of pure annoyance. Ducking under a low-hanging mangrove root draped in Spanish moss, I emerged into a small, sun-drenched basin. And there it was. On a strip of dry land maybe 50 feet across, nestled between saw palmettos, sat a bright green, 2-person dome tent. Just like she'd said. I pulled my canoe onto a muddy patch of bank, the thick mud sucking at my boots with a sound like a wet kiss. The heat in the clearing was a physical blow after the shade of the channels. The sun burned straight overhead, bleaching the color from the sky. I took a swig of warm water from my canteen and scanned the camp. It was a neat little setup. 2 folding chairs sat facing a stone fire ring. A half-empty cooler rested against the base of a gumbalimbo tree. It looked like the people had just stepped away for a minute. I approached cautiously. "Park ranger," I called out. "Anyone here?" Only the cicadas answered, their droning buzz intensifying in the heat. I walked to the fire ring. The stones were blackened, and inside was a small pile of charred wood. I knelt and held my hand over it. A faint wave of heat radiated from the coals. They were still smoldering. That's what got me. That's what set the first real spike of dread into my gut. In this humidity, with this much moisture in the air, fires die quick unless you feed them constantly. A fire that was still putting off heat meant whoever had been here must have left within the last hour. Maybe 2. I circled the tent. The permit tag was missing, a violation but not a major crime. The zipper was closed. "Park ranger," I called again, louder this time. "I'm going to have to look inside the tent for identification if you don't answer." Silence. My hand hesitated over the zipper tab. The memory of that other camp, 2 years ago, flashed in my mind, the 3 zipped sleeping bags, the smell of decay. I shook it off. That was a freak event. A one-off. This was just an abandoned campsite. I pulled the zipper. It made a loud, rasping sound in the quiet clearing. The tent flap fell open. Inside, it was dark and stifling. 1 sleeping bag, a blue synthetic mummy style, was laid out. It was not empty. It was zipped up almost to the top, and like those others from 2 years prior, it was clearly occupied. A lump where the head should be, the long shape of a body tapering down to the feet. "Sir." "Ma'am." My voice was tight. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I reached in and touched the nylon shell of the bag. It was damp. Not just damp, but cold. Clammy and cold, despite the suffocating heat inside the tent. And it was wet. A small puddle of brackish, foul-smelling water had soaked through the bottom of the sleeping bag and stained the tent floor. My training screamed at me to back away, call it in, and wait for backup. This was now a potential crime scene. But something else, a morbid and dreadful curiosity, took over. I grabbed the zipper tab of the sleeping bag and pulled it down. The face that stared back at me was pale and waterlogged. A man in his late 30s, maybe. His skin was swollen and split in places, the texture of old leather that had been left in the rain. His eyes, a startlingly light blue, were wide open, clouded over like frosted glass. His mouth was slightly agape, and a thin trickle of dark water ran from the corner of his lips onto the fabric of the bag. His clothes, a simple t-shirt and shorts, were soaked. The smell that billowed out was the same one I remembered, the deep, nauseating rot of the swamp's bottom. I recoiled, stumbling backward out of the tent, my boot catching on one of the folding chairs and sending it clattering to the ground. I zipped the tent shut on pure instinct, as if hiding the sight would make it unreal. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A man, drowned, zipped into a sleeping bag on dry land. The fire was still warm. There was no canoe. Where did he come from? Where did the water come from? I was fumbling for the radio on my vest, my fingers clumsy and slick with sweat, when I heard a splash. It wasn't the quick, sharp slap of a gator's tail hitting the water. It wasn't the gentle plop of a jumping mullet. This was heavy, slow, and deliberate. It was the sound of a person stepping into the shallows. I froze, turning my head toward the sound. It had come from the edge of the clearing, where the mangroves grew thick and their roots clawed down into the dark water of the channel. The water there was black, shaded by the canopy, holding no reflection. It was a strip of pure, opaque nothingness. I saw movement, a slow, rising shape. Human-shaped. A man rose out of the water. His head broke the surface first, dark hair plastered to his skull. Then his shoulders, his chest, he just kept coming up. He rose smoothly, without a struggle, until he was standing. But the water only came to his knees. He was impossibly tall, or the channel was impossibly shallow right there. His body was dark and slick with a film of algae and mud. He was naked from the waist up, his skin unnaturally pale beneath the grime. But it was his eyes that held me. They were the same color as the man in the tent, a cloudy, bleached-out blue. And they were locked on me. The man didn't speak. He just stood there in the shallows, a statue carved from mud and drowned flesh. His chest rose and fell, but it was too slow, an unnerving, tidal rhythm that didn't seem right for a living thing. The pale eyes were unblinking, fixed on me with a disquieting lack of expression. The water around his legs barely rippled, as if his presence absorbed all motion. But the smell hit me like a wave. It was the smell from the tent, magnified 100 times. Brackish rot, decaying vegetation, and something else, something uniquely foul, like meat that had been left in a bucket of seawater for a week. My fingers finally found the radio on my vest. I keyed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Calloway, do you copy?" All I got was a burst of harsh, cutting static. I tried again. Static. It was as if the air itself had turned to lead, blocking the signal. The atmospheric conditions out here could be tricky, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. I lowered the radio, my hand shaking slightly. My voice, when I used it, was a croak. "Sir," I called out, trying to keep it steady, professional. "This is a restricted area. I need you to step away from the water and show me your hands." He took one step toward me. Then another. He moved with a heavy, dragging slowness, his feet pulling from the muddy bottom with a soft, sickening schluck. That's when I realized something was profoundly wrong with his legs. From the knees down, they didn't seem to move on their own accord. The water moved them. As he lifted a foot, his shin and ankle swayed gently, like a reed caught in a current I couldn't see. It was as if he were a marionette, and the water was pulling the strings. He kept coming, one deliberate, dragging step at a time, until the water was only at his ankles. He was on the very cusp of the muddy bank. And then I saw it, a detail so impossible my brain struggled to process it. The ground beneath him, the wet mud at the water's edge, was rippling. Shifting. It was subtle, like the surface of a pond under a gentle rain. Only there was no rain. It was like the land itself was becoming water to accommodate him. I took a reflexive step back, then another, my boots crunching loudly on the dry, solid ground of the hammock. The sound seemed to break a spell. The man stopped at the water's edge, his bare, mud-caked toes just touching the line where wet gave way to dry. He tilted his head slightly, an unnervingly canine gesture of curiosity, as if my movement was a sound he hadn't heard before. Then his lips moved. They were gray and chapped, peeling at the edges. They parted, and a sound emerged, a whisper so low it was almost subliminal, lost beneath the droning of the cicadas and the buzzing of the flies that now swarmed around his head. I couldn't make out the words. But I swear, behind me, from inside the green tent, the nylon of the sleeping bag rustled. A cold dread, colder than any winter chill, washed over me. This thing, this man, was connected to the body in the tent. He was the source of it. He was the water that had drowned the man on dry land. My training, My instincts, my screaming survival brain all came to the same conclusion: run. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I didn't give him a chance to take another step. I turned, abandoning all thought of procedure or investigation, and bolted back the way I came, toward the muddy patch of bank where I'd left my canoe. My only thought was to get back on the water, put distance between me and that clearing, and paddle until my arms gave out. I crashed through the screen of mangroves, branches whipping at my face and arms. The sudden shade of the channel was a relief from the blinding sun. I reached the spot where I'd beached the canoe, my boots sinking into the familiar, sucking mud. And my heart stopped. The canoe was gone. Not adrift. Not tied loose and floated away on the turning tide. It was gone. The heavy-duty rope I'd tied to a thick mangrove root was still there, dangling in the air. The knot was still tied. But the end of the rope, the end that had been attached to the bow of my canoe, was frayed and darkened, as if it had simply dissolved. I stared at the empty space. The water in the channel was glassy, black, and silent. There was no sign of a struggle, no ripple to suggest something had been dragged under. My ride, my lifeline, my only way out of this labyrinth, had vanished into thin air. Or thin water. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around. The drowned man was standing not 10 feet away, on the dry ground of the hammock, well past the water's edge he had seemed unable to cross moments before. He hadn't walked around the thicket of mangroves, he must have come straight through it. But his pale skin was unbroken, not a scratch on him. He was dripping dark, silty water onto the parched earth, and the ground around his feet was turning dark and moist, the water sinking in with an unnatural speed. His cloudy eyes were locked on mine. He was closer now. Close enough for me to see the tiny, translucent things, like larval shrimp, wriggling in the film of algae on his skin. His gray lips parted again, but this time, he didn't whisper. This time, the voice wasn't in the air. It was in my head. You should not have come. The voice was not a sound. It was a feeling, a pressure, the sensation of cold water filling my sinuses, of words formed from the weight of the deep. It was a chorus and a single voice at once, ancient and patient and utterly without mercy. I scrambled backward, away from him, tripping over a root and falling hard onto my back. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I looked up from the ground, gasping for air, and saw him take another slow, dragging step. The ground beneath his feet sighed, softening, the dry leaves turning instantly to black mulch. He was bringing the swamp with him. He was turning the land into his domain, one step at a time. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It cuts through rational thought and leaves you with two primal commands: fight or flee. I chose flee. I scrambled to my feet and bolted, not back toward the empty channel, but deeper into the mangrove island, away from the creature. The voice echoed in my skull, a resonant, watery hum that vibrated behind my eyes. The land is just a memory of the sea. It all comes back to the water. I ran blindly, crashing through thickets of sawgrass that tore at my clothes and skin. Branches clawed at my arms, roots twisted under my boots like hidden snares, and every step felt like I was running through something that didn't want me to leave. The very air seemed to resist, thick and heavy as silt. The oppressive heat intensified, sweat stinging the fresh cuts on my face. I splashed through a shallow tidal channel that cut across the hammock. The water was shockingly cold, a thermal shock against the humid air. It only came up to my shins, but each step felt like plunging my legs into a bucket of ice. I swear I saw ephemeral shapes swirling in the dark water around my boots, pale, finger-like things that brushed against my legs as I splashed past. I cried out and scrambled up the opposite bank, my heart a wild drum against my ribs. Behind me, I heard a heavy splash. He was following. He didn't need to navigate the terrain, He just moved through it, the water his natural element, the land a temporary obstacle he could simply unmake. I tried my radio again, pressing the transmit button with a desperate thumb. The static that answered was different now. It was rhythmic. Beneath the harsh hiss, there was a sound like a slow, deep exhalation, a watery sigh that matched the cadence of the voice in my head. He was in the radio. He was in everything. My water bottle, clipped to the side of my pack, was gone. I didn't remember it falling, but when I reached for it, my hand met empty air. A small thing, but it sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I was trapped, isolated, and being stripped of my resources, one by one. I ran for what felt like an eternity, my lungs burning, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The mangrove forest was a disorienting maze. Every direction looked the same, a tangled mess of roots, a ceiling of leaves, and dark, still water. I was lost. Utterly and completely lost. Just when I thought I was going to collapse, I broke through a final screen of foliage into a clearing. It was another small basin, but in the center of it stood a structure, an old research platform on stilts, built years ago by a university team and long since abandoned. It was a simple square of weathered wood, maybe 12 feet across, standing about 6 feet above the dark water. A rickety-looking ladder led up to its deck. It was safety. It was high ground. I didn't hesitate. I sloshed through the shallow water at the edge of the basin and scrambled up the ladder. The wood was slick with algae and felt spongy under my hands, but it held. I hauled myself onto the platform deck, my chest heaving, and crawled to the center, trying to catch my breath. I took a moment to check my gear. My compass was still in my pocket. My GPS was dead, the screen blank. The radio was useless. My hatchet was still secure in its loop on my pack. It wasn't much, but it was something. I was alive. I was above the water. Then I heard it. Not a splash this time. A sound like a collective sigh, rising from all around me. I crawled to the edge of the platform and looked down. The water in the clearing began to move. Not from wind, not from fish. It was churning gently from below, as if something massive were rising from the muddy bottom. At first, it looked like a single, pale, undulating shape. But then I realized, with a lurch of my stomach, that it was dozens of them. Pale heads were breaking the surface, one after another, silent and serene. Men, women, even a few children. Their hair fanned out in the dark water like seaweed. Their faces were all the same, swollen, bleached, and placid. And their eyes, all of them, were the same cloudy, washed-out blue. They weren't swimming, they were just rising, a silent congregation of the drowned, their bodies bobbing gently in the water. They all turned their blank faces upward, all staring at me. And in the middle of them, rising higher than the rest, his head and shoulders completely clear of the water, was him. The drowned man. He wasn't treading water. He was standing on something I couldn't see, the silent king of this ghastly, floating court. He raised a hand from the water, a long, pale hand that didn't drip, and pointed a single, accusing finger at me. The voice returned, now a chorus in my mind, the blended thoughts of every drowned soul below me. You cannot escape the tide. You are already part of the water. They didn't try to climb. They didn't need to. They just floated closer, a silent, pale flotilla, their dead eyes fixed on me. The water around the platform's wooden stilts began to lap and churn with their proximity. The drowned man glided through his subjects until he was directly beneath me. He reached up, his unnaturally long fingers curling around one of the thick, creosote-soaked stilts that supported my corner of the platform. I heard the wood creak under his touch, a groaning, protesting sound. Where his pale fingers made contact, the dark wood began to lighten in color, then darken again as water soaked deep into the grain. The moisture spread, climbing the stilt like a disease, a network of black veins branching out from his hand, moving upward toward the deck. The wood, which had been dry and sun-bleached for years, was becoming waterlogged before my eyes. He was pulling the water up into it, making my island of safety a part of his domain. I scrambled back to the far side of the platform, my boots slipping on the deck. But the wood there felt damp, too. I looked down and saw dark, brackish water dripping from between the slats, splashing onto my boots. The entire structure was becoming saturated. The voices started again, a cacophony this time. It wasn't words so much as the sound of water rushing through old pipes, of waves breaking on a distant, stony shore, of the gurgle and suck of a whirlpool. It was a disorienting, nauseating sound that echoed not in my ears, but in the fluid of my skull. It promised a quiet, cold, weighted peace. It promised an end to the heat and the fear and the struggle. Let go. Come down. Join the quiet. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did nothing. The sound was inside me. I tried not to look at the faces in the water, but a sudden movement caught my eye. Something was climbing up from underneath the platform. Driven by a morbid impulse, I snatched up my heavy-duty flashlight from my pack, flicked it on, and aimed the beam down between the slats of the platform floor. In the cone of white light, I saw an arm. Pale, bloated, and greened with algae, it was groping blindly in the dark space beneath the deck. Then another appeared beside it. And another. They were coming up through the gaps, thin enough to squeeze their boneless-looking limbs between the planks. A wave of pure, animal panic seized me. I dropped the flashlight and it rolled into a corner, its beam cutting a frantic swath across the scene. I stomped hard with my heel on the deck next to where one of the hands was emerging. I felt the spongy wood give under the impact, heard a wet, snapping sound, but it didn't slow them. A hand, shockingly cold and strong, shot up through a gap and grabbed my ankle. The touch was electric ice. It wasn't just cold, it was a profound absence of heat that seemed to suck the warmth right out of my bones. I yelled, a raw, ragged sound, and kicked wildly with my other foot. My boot connected with the thing's wrist, and the grip loosened. I kicked again, harder, and scrambled away, grabbing for the hatchet on my belt. My fingers closed around the rubberized handle. I turned back as another arm slithered up onto the deck. I swung the hatchet in a desperate, horizontal arc. The blade was sharp. It bit deep, severing the wrist with a wet, solid thunk. But instead of blood, a gushing spray of black, stinking water erupted from the stump. It drenched my legs, soaking my pants to the knee. The severed hand fell limp on the deck, twitching for a moment before dissolving into a puddle of dark slime. The voice of the drowned man hissed in my head, sharp and clear above the chorus. "You're already wet." That was when the far leg of the platform, the one he was holding, snapped. The sound was like a cannon shot. The entire structure lurched violently, tilting at a horrifying angle. I was thrown to my knees, sliding across the slick, wet planks toward the rising water. The drowned faces surged upward to meet me, their arms outstretched. I looked up and saw the drowned man. He hadn't been thrown off balance. As the deck tilted down to meet the water, he simply stepped onto it, his bare feet making no sound on the wet wood. He stood over me, a tall, dark silhouette against the glaring sky, water cascading from his body. He looked down at me with his cloudy, pitiless eyes. "It is time," the voices whispered, "to come home." I didn't think, I just jumped. My mind, stripped of all complex thought, fixated on a single, desperate image I'd logged moments before, a narrow cut in the mangroves on the far side of the basin, a potential escape route. I didn't jump into the crowd of pale, waiting faces below. I launched myself sideways, off the high edge of the tilting platform, aiming for that dark opening. I hit the water hard. The cold was a total system shock. It drove the air from my lungs in a single, painful gasp, and for a terrifying second, my muscles seized. The water was thicker than it should be, heavy and clinging, like I'd jumped into oil. It filled my ears, silencing the world and amplifying the rushing sound in my head. Panic gave way to pure adrenaline. I kicked for the surface, my head breaking into the humid air with a sputter. Something brushed my back, long and smooth. Fingers or fins, I couldn't tell and didn't want to know. I swam harder than I have ever swum in my life, a frantic, sloppy crawl, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the ache in my shoulders. The water fought me. I felt a constant, gentle pulling at my legs, a subtle current trying to drag me back toward the center of the basin, back toward them. The voice was a constant, seductive murmur now, a deep thrumming that vibrated through the water and into my bones. So heavy. Let go. Rest. I ignored it. I focused on the dark slash of the channel ahead. Mangrove roots, sunlight, safety. My arms windmill, my legs kicked, my boots felt like anchors. I felt another touch, this time on my boot, a brief, cold grip that I kicked free from. I reached the channel and clawed my way into the tangle of roots, pulling myself forward hand over hand, half swimming, half crawling through the shallow, muddy water. Branches snagged my shirt, roots scraped my shins raw, but I didn't stop. I could feel the presence behind me, the vast, cold weight of them filling the basin. Then, light. I broke through the last tangle of roots and saw it, the wide, familiar expanse of Chokoloskee Bay. And maybe 200 yards away, shimmering in the heat haze, was the ranger station dock. Hope is a powerful fuel. I found a new reserve of strength and swam for it, my movements more controlled now, my terror refined into a sharp, desperate focus. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. When my knees finally scraped sand and shell in the shallows by the dock, I could barely stand. I hauled myself up the boat ramp on my hands and knees, collapsing onto the hot concrete, coughing up lungfuls of foul, brackish swamp water. My boots sloshed, leaving dark puddles around me. After a minute, I managed to push myself up and turn. I looked back at the channel I had just escaped from. It was empty. The water was calm, glinting under the afternoon sun. There were no pale faces. No churning current. No drowned man. There was nothing but the quiet, indifferent green of the mangroves. I never filed the full report. What would I have said? That I was chased by a waterlogged ghost and his army of the drowned? That the land itself turned to water under his feet? They would have put me on indefinite leave, sent me for a psychiatric evaluation. I would have lost the only job I'd ever loved. The official story was that I found a camp, confirmed a single deceased individual, and then, during my return, my canoe was swamped in a sudden squall. I lost most of my equipment but managed to swim back to the station. A recovery team was dispatched the next day. They found the tent, the sleeping bag, and the body of Jonathan Miller, a tourist from Ohio. The canoe was never found. The coroner listed his cause of death as drowning, but added a lengthy, confused addendum titled Undetermined Contributing Factors, citing the lack of water at the scene. It was filed away, another anomaly. But I know. I carry the truth of it with me every day. It's in the way I hesitate before stepping into the canoe. It's in the phantom sensation of cold water closing around my ankle that sometimes wakes me from a dead sleep. I still work here. Leaving feels like surrender, like letting him win. But I don't go into the 10,000 Islands backcountry alone anymore. And every time I go near that part of the park, even on the main channels, the air feels heavier. The water looks darker, holding secrets in its opaque depths. Sometimes, when the tide is low and the sun is setting, I'll be turning the canoe to head home. And out of the corner of my eye, I'll see him. A tall, dark figure standing knee-deep in the shallows, half hidden by the mangrove shadows, watching me with those pale, empty eyes. I've learned not to look too long. I've learned to just keep paddling. Because I know he's not just watching. He's waiting. Waiting for the water in me to recognize the water in him. Waiting for me to come home.